Status anxiety. You're sitting in a meeting. A colleague mentions their promotion. Something twists in your chest. It's not that you wanted that exact position. It's not even that you dislike them. But suddenly you're measuring, comparing, wondering if you're falling behind. The conversation continues around you. You're barely listening. You're too busy calculating where you stand. This is status anxiety, the constant low-grade panic that your position in the social order is slipping. Or maybe it was never quite secure to begin with. It's not about wanting more success. It's about the terror of being seen as less. And the exhausting part. It never fully goes away. There's always someone ahead, always something to prove, always a new benchmark that resets the entire game. The mechanism is simple. Humans are wired to care about rank. For most of our evolutionary history, social position determined survival. Being valued by the group meant protection, resources, access. Being cast out meant danger, sometimes death. That calculus is still running in the background of every social interaction, even when the stakes are nothing like they used to be. Status anxiety kicks in the moment we sense a threat to our standing. It doesn't require an actual loss, just the possibility. A friend buys a house. A coworker gets recognized. Someone younger achieves what you haven't yet. None of it is directed at you. But it registers as a challenge. Your brain flags it as a problem that needs solving, except there's no clear solution. So the worry just sits there humming. Modern life has multiplied the arenas where status gets measured. It's not just your career anymore. It's your social life, your appearance, your taste, your opinions, even your hobbies. Every space has a hierarchy. Every hierarchy has people watching. Social media turned this into a feedback loop that never stops. You can see in real time who's ahead, who's applauded, who's ignored. The comparisons are endless. So is the anxiety. And here's the trap. The more you try to secure your position, the more fragile it feels. You chase credentials, accomplishments, approval. But achievements don't cure status anxiety. They just shift the target. Once you reach one level, the next one becomes visible. The finish line keeps moving. The fear of slipping back never stops. People caught in this loop start making decisions they don't even want. They take jobs for the title, not the work. They buy things to signal success, not because they care about the object. They defend opinions they're not sure about because changing their mind feels like admitting weakness. The anxiety doesn't guide them toward what they value. It pushes them toward what they think will protect their rank. The worst part is how invisible this becomes. Status anxiety doesn't announce itself. It masquerades as ambition, as standards, as just wanting to do well. But underneath, it's fear. Fear of being dismissed. Fear of being ordinary. Fear that if you stop climbing, you'll become irrelevant. Status anxiety doesn't resolve by winning. It resolves by recognizing the game itself. Because as long as your sense of worth depends on where you rank, you'll never feel secure. Someone will always be ahead. Something will always threaten your position. And the exhaustion of constantly defending yourself against invisible comparisons will never end. Superiority illusion. Ask someone to rate themselves as a driver. Most will say above average. Ask them about their intelligence, their judgment, their taste. Same pattern. Statistically, most people can't be above average. That's not how averages work. But almost everyone believes they are. This is the superiority illusion. The quiet, persistent belief that you're better than most people at most things, even when there's no reason to think so. It's not loud arrogance. It's subtler. A background assumption that your perspective is clearer, your reasoning is sharper, your mistakes are more forgivable. And the truly strange part, this belief operates even when you have zero evidence for it. The psychology behind this is surprisingly efficient. Your brain has access to one dataset in vivid, exhaustive detail, your own thoughts, intentions, and reasoning. You know why you made that decision. You understand the context behind your mistake. You see the complexity of your position. But everyone else, you only see their actions, their outcomes, their surface. The internal logic that justifies their choices is invisible to you. So naturally, their behavior looks less thoughtful, less justified, less competent than yours. This creates a built-in bias. You judge yourself by your intentions. You judge others by their results. When you make a mistake, you know it was circumstantial and exception. When someone else makes the same mistake, it reveals something about their character, their ability, their judgment. The comparison is rigged from the start. The conclusion is always the same. You come out ahead. The illusion gets reinforced in everyday interactions. In meetings, you notice when others ramble, when their ideas miss the point, when their logic falters. You rarely notice when you do the same. From the inside, your tangents feel relevant. Your ideas feel sharp. Your reasoning feels sound. The selective attention stacks the evidence in your favor. It happens in friendships, too. You think you're the better listener, the more thoughtful one, the person who really gets it. Your friend probably thinks the exact same thing about themselves. Both of you are holding an invisible scorecard where you're winning. Neither of you realizes the other person is keeping score too. The superiority illusion doesn't just distort how you see yourself. It shapes how you treat disagreement. If you start from the assumption that your judgment is better, then anyone who disagrees isn't offering a different perspective. They're just wrong. They didn't think it through. They're biased, defensive, missing the obvious. The possibility that they might be right, and you might be mistaken, doesn't register as plausible. Because if you're generally above average, then your position is probably the correct one. This makes learning almost impossible. If you assume you're already better than most people, feedback doesn't land as useful information. It lands as an error someone else made in evaluating you. Criticism isn't a signal to adjust. It's noise to be dismissed. The illusion doesn't just protect your ego. It traps you in your current level of understanding. And here's the deepest problem. The illusion is self-reinforcing. The less aware you are of your limitations, the more confident you feel. The more confident you feel, the less you question yourself. The less you question yourself, the less you notice when you're wrong. It's a closed loop. Most people never realize they're inside it. The superiority illusion isn't about being deluded. It's about having asymmetric information and a brain that fills in the gaps in a predictable direction. But recognizing that the gap exists, that everyone else's internal world is just as complex and justified as yours, requires something most people never do. Assuming you might be the one who's average. Social comparison. How often do you check how many likes someone else got? How often do you notice what car your neighbor drives, what school their kids got into, what vacation they just posted about? You tell yourself you're just curious, just browsing. But the feeling that follows isn't neutral. It's a quiet discomfort, a sense that you're measuring up or falling short, even when no one asked you to compete. Humans don't experience their lives in a vacuum. We experience them relative to others. A salary feels generous or insufficient depending on what your peers earn. An accomplishment feels meaningful or trivial depending on what someone else just achieved. The psychological term for this is social comparison orientation, but the concept is simpler than that. We're constantly gauging where we stand by looking at everyone around us. The drive to compare is hardwired. In ancestral environments, knowing your position in the group determined resource access, mating opportunities, survival odds. Being slightly better than average mattered. Being noticeably worse mattered more. The instinct to track relative standing was adaptive. It kept you alert to threats and opportunities. But that same instinct in the modern world creates a different problem. You're not just comparing yourself to the handful of people in your immediate tribe anymore. You're comparing yourself to everyone. Classmates, co-workers, distant acquaintances, strangers on the internet. The scope is endless. The benchmarks shift constantly. And the comparisons never resolve into anything useful because there's always another reference point, another metric, another person doing better. What makes this worse is that the comparisons are almost always skewed. You compare your behind-the-scenes reality to everyone else's highlight reel. You see their vacation photos, their promotions, their polished social moments. You don't see their doubt, their failures, their ordinary Tuesdays. So the data you're using to evaluate yourself is fundamentally distorted. You're measuring your whole messy life against carefully curated snapshots designed to impress. This doesn't just make you feel worse. It changes what you pursue. When your sense of worth is tied to relative position, you start chasing things that look good in comparison rather than things you actually value. You take the job with the better title even if the work is worse. You buy the thing that signals status even if you don't care about the object. You shape your choices around how they'll be perceived, not around what matters to you. The exhausting part is that it never ends. Even when you win a comparison, the relief is temporary. You move up one rung, and immediately you're looking at the next one. The finish line doesn't exist. The game just keeps resetting with new players, new benchmarks, new ways to feel like you're not enough. Social comparison isn't inherently destructive. It can motivate, it can inspire. But when it becomes the primary lens through which you evaluate your life, it stops being useful. Because your worth isn't a ranking. It's not something that increases when someone else does poorly or decreases when someone else succeeds. But as long as you're measuring yourself against an endless stream of others, that's exactly how it will feel. Envy. A friend tells you about their promotion. They're excited. You congratulate them. You mean it. But underneath the warmth, there's something else. A tightness in your chest. A voice in your head asking why it wasn't you. You don't want to feel this way. You're genuinely happy for them. But the feeling sits there anyway, quiet and uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. That feeling has a name. Envy. And it's one of the most misunderstood emotions we experience. People talk about it like it's a character flaw, a sign of pettiness or insecurity. But envy isn't a moral failing. It's a signal, a reaction to perceived inequality in something you care about. Envy shows up when someone else has something you want and don't have. It's not about hating them. It's about the gap. The reminder that they're ahead in a domain that matters to you. The more you value that domain, the sharper the envy. If you don't care about status, someone else's promotion doesn't sting. If you don't care about appearance, someone else's compliments don't register. But when it's something you've been working toward, something you've invested in, watching someone else get it first feels like a loss even though nothing was taken from you. The psychology of envy is rooted in comparison. Humans are social learners. We figure out what's valuable by watching what others pursue and achieve. When someone in our peer group gets something, our brain interprets it as proof that the thing is attainable, desirable, worth having. But if we don't have it yet, that same proof becomes painful. It highlights the gap between where we are and where we want to be. What makes envy so uncomfortable is that it often targets people we like. You don't envy strangers as intensely as you envy peers. A celebrity's success feels distant, irrelevant to your life. But when a coworker gets promoted, when a friend buys a house, when someone in your social circle achieves what you've been striving for, the envy cuts deeper. Because the comparison feels direct. They're close enough to you that their success implies something about your position. If they can have it, why can't you? Envy doesn't just make you feel bad. It changes behavior. Some people respond by working harder, using the feeling as fuel. But just as often, envy leads to withdrawal. You start avoiding the person. You minimize their success in your mind. You find reasons why it doesn't count, why they didn't really earn it, why it won't last. Not because you're cruel, but because the gap is painful and your brain is trying to close it by reframing the situation. The most destructive form of envy isn't the sharp, obvious kind. It's the quiet, chronic version that sits in the background of your social life. The low-grade discomfort when you see someone else's success. The reflexive need to measure yourself against every peer. The sense that other people's wins somehow diminish your own worth. Over time, this turns relationships into competitions you didn't sign up for and accomplishments into rankings that never feel good enough. Envy doesn't disappear by pretending it's not there. It fades when you recognize what it's actually telling you. Not that you're a bad person, but that you're comparing yourself in a domain that matters to you. The question isn't whether you feel envy. It's whether you let it define how you see yourself and the people around you. Status signaling. You're not buying the watch because you need to tell time. You're not buying the handbag because you need something to carry your keys. You're buying them because of what they say. About your taste, your success, your place in the world. And the strange part is that everyone involved knows this. The buyer knows. The seller knows. The people who see it know. But the transaction happens anyway because the signal is the point. Status signaling is the practice of displaying markers that communicate your position in a social hierarchy. It's not new. Humans have been doing it for as long as hierarchies have existed. Elaborate clothing, expensive possessions, exclusive memberships, prestigious affiliations. The content changes across cultures and eras, but the function stays the same. You're broadcasting information about where you rank, and others are reading that information to decide how to treat you. The mechanism is surprisingly efficient. In a world where you can't directly assess someone's resources, competence, or connections, visible markers serve as shortcuts. The car someone drives, the neighborhood they live in, the brands they wear. These aren't just objects. They're data points. Signals that others use to infer your status without needing to know you personally. But here's where it gets complicated. Once everyone understands that certain markers signal high status, those markers become valuable not for their function but for their signaling power. The handbag stops being about utility. It's about what carrying that particular handbag communicates. And because the signal only works if it's hard to fake, the price escalates. The exclusivity increases. The access becomes more restricted. The object becomes valuable precisely because most people can't have it. This creates a never-ending arms race. As more people acquire a status marker, it loses its signaling power. So new markers emerge. Limited editions. Insider knowledge. Subtle distinctions that only people in the know can recognize. What started as a clear signal becomes a constantly shifting game where the cost of entry keeps rising and the targets keep moving. The real cost of status signaling isn't the money. It's the attention. When you're focused on what your choices signal to others, you stop asking what you actually want. You take the job that sounds impressive over the one you'd enjoy. You buy the thing that broadcasts success over the thing that serves your needs. You curate your life for an audience that may not even care as much as you think they do. Status signaling becomes a trap when it replaces actual goals with performative ones. You're not building something meaningful. You're assembling the appearance of having built something meaningful. You're not cultivating taste. You're displaying the markers of taste. The signal becomes the end in itself, and the substance it's supposed to represent fades into the background. What makes this particularly insidious is that it operates mostly below conscious awareness. You don't think, I'm going to buy this to signal my status. You think, I like this. This feels right. This represents who I am. But the reason it feels right is often because it carries the social weight you've internalized. The prestige. The recognition. The validation that comes from being seen as someone who belongs. Status signaling isn't going away. Humans are social animals. We care about where we stand, but recognizing when you're signaling rather than choosing gives you a choice. To ask whether the thing you're pursuing actually matters to you, or whether it just matters to the invisible audience you're performing for. Relative deprivation. Two people earn the same salary, same job, same city, same expenses. One feels comfortable. The other feels broke. The difference isn't the money. It's who they're comparing themselves to. This is relative deprivation. The sense of lacking something not because you don't have enough in absolute terms, but because you have less than the people around you. It's not about poverty. It's about position. You can have everything you need and still feel deprived if the people in your reference group have more. The psychology is straightforward. Humans don't evaluate their circumstances in isolation. We evaluate them relative to a comparison set. Usually, that set is made up of people similar to us. Same age, same profession, same social circle. When those people have more, bigger, better, it doesn't just register as information. It registers as falling behind. Even when your objective situation hasn't changed, the relative gap creates a feeling of loss. This is why a modest raise can feel disappointing if your coworker got a bigger one. Why a nice apartment can feel inadequate if your friend just bought a house. Why an accomplishment can feel hollow if someone else's accomplishment overshadows it. The thing itself hasn't lost value, but its value relative to what others have makes it feel insufficient. Relative deprivation drives behavior in ways that absolute conditions don't. People tolerate genuine hardship if everyone around them is experiencing it too. But they resent smaller inequalities if those inequalities feel unfair. A soldier doesn't mind the discomfort of the field if everyone's in the same situation. But if some soldiers get better conditions while doing the same work, resentment builds fast. It's not the hardship that's intolerable. It's the visible gap. This plays out constantly in modern life. You're satisfied with your income until you learn what your peers make. You're content with your career until you see someone else's trajectory. You're fine with your life until you scroll through social media and see curated snapshots of everyone else's highlight reel. The comparisons don't improve your understanding of your situation. They just create dissatisfaction where none existed before. What makes relative deprivation particularly cruel is that it scales with proximity. You don't feel deprived when comparing yourself to a billionaire. That gap is too large, too abstract. But when someone in your office, your neighborhood, your friend group pulls ahead, the deprivation is immediate. They're close enough that the comparison feels direct. Their success implies something about your position. If they can have it and you can't, the gap feels like a verdict. The trap is that no amount of achievement solves relative deprivation. You get the raise, and suddenly you're comparing yourself to people who earn even more. You get the promotion, and now the benchmark shifts to the next level. The gap doesn't close. It just relocates, because relative deprivation isn't about reaching a threshold. It's about the endless repositioning of yourself against others. Recognizing relative deprivation doesn't eliminate the feeling, but it separates the feeling from reality. The discomfort isn't proof that you don't have enough. It's proof that you're measuring yourself against the wrong scale. And as long as the scale is other people, the measurement will always leave you wanting. Prestige bias. Watch who people listen to in a meeting. It's rarely the person with the best idea. It's the person with the most credibility, the senior title, the impressive background, the recognizable name. Their suggestion gets consideration. Thoughtful nods. Follow-up questions. Someone without those markers says the exact same thing 5 minutes earlier, and it barely registers. The idea hasn't changed. The perceived authority behind it has. Prestige bias is the tendency to assign more weight to information, ideas, or opinions based on who's delivering them rather than the content itself. We like to think we evaluate arguments on their merits. But in practice, we're running a constant background check on the source. And if the source ranks high in prestige, the message gets an automatic credibility boost. This isn't conscious calculation. You don't think, this person has credentials, so I should believe them more. It happens faster than that. Your brain uses prestige as a shortcut. In a world with infinite information and limited time, you can't evaluate everything from scratch, so you defer to markers of expertise: the degree, the job title, the publication, the platform. These signal that someone probably knows what they're talking about, which means you can trust their judgment without doing the full analysis yourself. The evolutionary logic is clear. Learning from high-status individuals was adaptive. If someone had survived long enough, accumulated enough resources, earned enough respect, their knowledge was probably worth copying. Paying attention to prestige meant learning faster and making fewer costly mistakes. But the same shortcut in modern contexts creates distortions. Prestige doesn't always correlate with accuracy. The famous economist isn't necessarily right about this particular policy. The celebrated author isn't necessarily insightful about this particular topic. The influential executive isn't necessarily correct about this particular strategy, but their prestige makes their opinions feel more credible than they objectively are. This bias shows up everywhere. In hiring, a candidate from a prestigious university gets more benefit of the doubt than an identical candidate from an unknown school. In media, a quote from a famous figure carries more weight than the same statement from someone obscure. In social settings, the opinion of the high-status person shapes the conversation more than the quiet insight from someone less visible. What makes prestige bias particularly stubborn is that it's self-reinforcing. People with prestige get more opportunities to speak, to publish, to influence. Their ideas spread further, get cited more, build more credibility, which increases their prestige, which increases the weight given to their next idea. The feedback loop doesn't care whether they're actually right more often. It just cares that they're already established. The cost isn't just that you miss good ideas from low prestige sources. It's that you stop questioning high prestige sources even when you should. Prestige becomes a substitute for verification. If someone credible said it, it must be true. If someone important believes it, it must be worth believing. The shortcut stops being a tool for efficiency and becomes a barrier to critical thinking. Prestige bias doesn't disappear when you know about it, but recognizing it gives you a choice. To ask whether you're evaluating the idea or the resume. To notice when you're deferring to authority rather than engaging with the argument. To separate the message from the messenger, at least long enough to decide if the message actually holds up on its own. Dominance versus prestige. There are two ways to get to the top. You can make people afraid of you, or you can make people respect you. Both work. Both get you influence, but they operate through completely different mechanisms and produce completely different social dynamics. Dominance is status through force. Intimidation, aggression, control. The person who dominates doesn't need to be liked. They need to be obeyed. They secure their position by making the cost of challenging them too high. Physical threat in some contexts. Social punishment in others. Economic leverage. Reputational damage. The specific tool varies, but the function is the same. Comply or face consequences. Prestige is status through admiration. Skill, knowledge, competence, charisma. The person with prestige doesn't need to be feared. They need to be valued. They secure their position by making others want to learn from them, associate with them, emulate them. People defer not because they have to, but because they choose to. The high-prestige individual offers something others want access to, and that access is granted voluntarily. Both paths deliver influence. But the quality of that influence is different. Dominance gets compliance. People do what you want because refusing is costly. But the moment the cost drops, the compliance disappears. Remove the threat, and the power evaporates. Prestige gets willing cooperation. People do what you suggest because they trust your judgment. Even when you're not watching. Even when there's no enforcement mechanism. The influence persists because it's rooted in respect, not fear. The difference shows up in how people talk about you when you're not in the room. The dominant figure is obeyed in their presence and resented in their absence. People comply, but they don't internalize. They're waiting for the power to shift. The prestigious figure is respected whether they're present or not. People genuinely believe in their ideas, adopt their methods, defend their reputation. The influence goes deeper because it was never forced. In modern hierarchies, both types exist, often simultaneously. The boss who rules through intimidation and the colleague who leads through competence. The loud, aggressive personality who controls the room, and the quiet expert everyone turns to for answers. They're competing for influence using entirely different strategies, and which one wins depends on the environment. Dominance thrives in zero-sum, high-threat contexts. When resources are scarce, when competition is direct, when failure has severe consequences, people defer to whoever can protect them or punish them. Prestige thrives in cooperative, information-rich contexts. When success depends on collaboration, when knowledge matters more than force, when people have options, they gravitate toward those they respect rather than those they fear. What's fascinating is that both strategies can look like confidence from the outside. The dominant person projects certainty through aggression. The prestigious person projects certainty through competence. But the internal experience is different. Dominance requires constant vigilance. Any sign of weakness invites challenge. Prestige, once established, is more stable. It doesn't need to be defended at every moment because it's built on demonstrated value rather than threatened consequences. Recognizing the distinction doesn't tell you which path to choose. But it clarifies what you're actually responding to when someone has power over you. Whether you're complying because you're afraid or following because you're convinced. And whether the influence you're building is the kind that lasts or the kind that collapses the moment you look away. Inferiority compensation. Someone cuts you off in conversation. You feel a flash of heat. Your jaw tightens. And before you've even processed it, you're preparing a response. Not to contribute, to reclaim. To prove you're not the one who gets ignored. The urge isn't about the topic anymore. It's about reasserting your position, showing you're not at the bottom of this interaction. When people feel inferior, they don't just sit with the discomfort. They compensate. They overperform. They overact. They push harder, louder, more visibly than the situation requires. Not because they're genuinely confident, but because the alternative, accepting the lower position, feels intolerable. Inferiority compensation is the drive to counteract feelings of inadequacy by exaggerating status signals. You feel small, so you act big. You feel uncertain, so you project certainty. You feel overlooked, so you demand attention. The behavior isn't proportional to the context. It's proportional to the internal threat. The mechanism is straightforward. Status threats trigger a defensive response. Your brain interprets the feeling of being less than as a problem that needs solving. But instead of addressing the underlying insecurity, you address the visible symptom. You buy the flashy car. You dominate the conversation. You name drop. You overcorrect in the exact domain where you feel adequate, trying to prove to others and to yourself that you're not actually lacking. This shows up constantly in social settings. The person who feels intellectually insecure becomes aggressively pedantic. The person who feels socially marginal becomes the loudest in the room. The person who doubts their competence at work becomes defensive about every minor critique, turning small feedback into battles over respect. The compensation isn't about the specific issue. It's about the deeper feeling that their position is precarious. What makes this pattern so transparent to everyone else is that the compensation overshoots. Someone secure in their intelligence doesn't need to prove it in every conversation. Someone confident in their status doesn't react to minor slights like existential threats. The overreaction signals exactly what it's trying to hide. The more aggressively someone compensates, the clearer it becomes that they're operating from a position of felt inadequacy. The trap is that compensation doesn't resolve the underlying feeling. It might deliver temporary relief. You asserted yourself. You got noticed. You proved something. But the insecurity is still there. And now it's paired with a pattern that alienates the people around you. Because nobody enjoys being around someone who's constantly performing superiority to mask their fear of being inferior. Inferiority compensation becomes most visible in people who've recently gained status. The newly promoted manager who micromanages to prove authority. The newly wealthy person who can't stop mentioning their wealth. The newly credentialed professional who introduces themselves by listing degrees. They haven't internalized the status yet. They're still defending against the feeling of not belonging, and the defense is louder than anything a secure person would need. Recognizing compensation in yourself is uncomfortable. It requires admitting that the performance is a defense. That the aggression, the showing off, the need to dominate isn't strength. It's a reaction to feeling weak. But once you see the pattern, you can choose differently. Not to perform status. Just to stop defending against a threat that exists mostly in your own perception. Prestige signaling. Why do people put degrees on their email signatures? Why do they mention where they went to school in unrelated conversations? Why do they reference the important person they know, the exclusive event they attended, the credential they earned? It's not because the information is necessary. It's because the information does something. It signals. Prestige signaling is the act of displaying markers that communicate your access to valued knowledge, skills, or networks. Unlike status signaling, which broadcasts wealth or power, prestige signaling broadcasts competence, expertise, or insider access. You're not showing that you can afford something expensive. You're showing that you know something valuable, or that you're connected to people who do. The markers are subtle. The casual mention of a prestigious institution. The offhand reference to a respected mentor. The tasteful credential in your bio. The insider knowledge dropped into conversation. It's all designed to establish that you're not just anyone. You're someone who belongs in high competence circles. And it works. Because humans use prestige as a proxy for trustworthiness. If you trained at a top institution, your judgment is probably sound. If you're connected to respected figures, you're probably worth listening to. If you have access to exclusive information, you're probably in the know. The signal shortcuts the evaluation. Instead of testing your actual knowledge, people defer to the markers that suggest you have it. This isn't new. Prestige signaling has always existed. Robes, titles, insignia. Visible markers that said, I have been granted access to knowledge or networks you don't have. What's changed is the scale and the subtlety. Social media turned prestige signaling into a constant background hum. Every profile is a curated list of credentials. Every post is an opportunity to reference affiliations. The competition for prestige isn't happening in isolated moments. It's happening continuously, in spaces where everyone can see everyone else's markers and adjust their own accordingly. The problem with prestige signaling isn't that it's dishonest. Most of the markers are factually true. The problem is that it replaces substance with symbols. You stop asking whether someone's idea is good and start asking whether their resume is impressive. You stop evaluating the argument and start evaluating the affiliations. The signal becomes the thing that matters, and the actual competence it's supposed to represent fades into the background. What makes prestige signaling particularly insidious is that it's socially rewarded. People who signal well get more opportunities, more invitations, more trust, more visibility, which gives them more to signal about. The cycle reinforces itself, and the people who are best at broadcasting their credentials pull further ahead. regardless of whether their actual competence justifies the gap. The exhausting part is that once you're aware of the game, it's hard not to play. If everyone else is signaling, staying quiet feels like conceding ground. If prestige markers are how people decide who to listen to, not displaying yours feels like self-sabotage. You're not trying to be arrogant. You're just trying to be taken seriously in a system that uses credentials as shorthand for credibility. Prestige signaling isn't going to disappear. Humans need shortcuts. Credentials and affiliations provide useful information. But recognizing when you're signaling rather than contributing gives you leverage. To ask whether the marker you're about to drop actually adds value to the conversation, or whether you're just trying to remind people that you belong. To notice when you're deferring to someone's prestige rather than engaging with their idea. To separate the signal from the substance, at least long enough to see which one actually matters. Rank sensitivity. Some people walk into a room and immediately start calculating. Who's above them? Who's below them? Where they fit? It's not a conscious process. It's automatic, a reflex. They track every micro-signal, every deference, every assertion, every subtle shift in who's getting heard and who's being ignored, and their comfort in the room depends entirely on where they land in that invisible ranking. Rank sensitivity is the heightened awareness of an emotional reactivity to social hierarchies. For highly rank-sensitive people, status isn't just one factor among many. It's the primary lens through which they experience social life. Every interaction is filtered through the question of relative position. Am I above or below this person? Are they showing me the respect my rank deserves? Am I gaining or losing ground? This isn't the same as caring about success. Everyone cares about doing well. Rank sensitivity is about the constant, low-level tracking of where you stand relative to others, and the emotional weight that tracking carries. It's the difference between wanting to do good work and needing to be recognized as better than your peers. Between enjoying an achievement and needing it to be visibly superior to someone else's. The psychology roots in uncertainty. When your sense of self is unstable, external validation becomes critical. And the clearest form of external validation is rank. Being above others is proof that you're valued. Being below them is proof that you're not. For highly rank-sensitive individuals, the hierarchy isn't just a social fact. It's a referendum on their worth. This creates hypervigilance. Every social cue gets interpreted through a status lens. A colleague gets credit for an idea. That's not just an event. It's a threat. Someone else is rising, which means you might be falling. A friend achieves something notable. That's not just their success. It's a recalibration of where you stand. The emotional register isn't happiness for them. It's anxiety about what their gain means for your position. What makes rank sensitivity exhausting is that the evaluations never stop. Every conversation, every email, every meeting, every post. There's always a status dimension to decode. Who's being praised? Who's being overlooked? Who's asserting dominance? Who's conceding ground? The mental load isn't about the content of the interaction. It's about the positioning. Rank-sensitive people often don't realize how much energy they're spending on this. From the inside, it feels like normal social awareness, paying attention to dynamics, reading the room. But the intensity is different. Someone low in rank sensitivity notices status when it's relevant and forgets about it when it's not. Someone high in rank sensitivity never stops tracking it. The hierarchy is always active, always updating, always emotionally significant. This affects relationships in predictable ways. Friendships become unstable when one person advances faster than the other. Collaborations turn competitive when rank-sensitive individuals perceive any success as relative rather than shared. Criticism, even constructive, lands as a status attack rather than useful feedback. Because every input is being processed through the question of what it says about their position. Rank sensitivity also drives behavior that others find off-putting. The constant need to assert superiority. The inability to celebrate someone else's win without finding a way to minimize it or redirect attention. The defensiveness when someone else gets recognition. It's not that rank-sensitive people are malicious. It's that their emotional stability is tied to their relative position, and anything that threatens that position triggers a defensive reaction. Recognizing rank sensitivity in yourself is difficult because the behavior feels justified. Of course you're tracking who's ahead. Of course you're defending your position. Of course you're reacting to slights. The world is competitive. But when the tracking becomes constant, when the defense becomes reflexive, when your emotional state depends on where you stand in every micro-hierarchy, you're not responding to the world. You're responding to an internal sensitivity that's turned every interaction into a status contest. And that contest, no matter how many times you win, never actually ends. Competitive status seeking. You'd think people would be satisfied once they have enough. Enough money. Enough recognition. Enough success. But that's not how it works. Because for some people, enough isn't a fixed threshold. It's a moving target, defined not by what they have, but by what others have. And as long as someone else has more, enough is always just out of reach. Competitive status seeking is the drive to achieve not for the sake of the achievement itself, but to surpass others. It's not about hitting a goal. It's about being ahead. The satisfaction doesn't come from what you've accomplished. It comes from where you rank. And the moment someone else pulls ahead, your own accomplishments lose their meaning. This mindset turns every domain into a competition. Career, wealth, relationships, parenting, hobbies, even rest. If someone else is doing it better, or just doing it differently in a way that seems more impressive, the comparison starts. And the comparison doesn't inspire. It corrodes. Because you're not measuring yourself against your own standards. You're measuring yourself against an endless parade of people who are always, in some dimension, ahead. The psychology is rooted in zero-sum thinking. Competitive status seekers operate as if status is a fixed pie. If someone else gets a bigger slice, yours must be smaller. If they succeed, you've lost ground. It's not true. Most forms of success aren't zero-sum. But the belief drives the behavior anyway. And the behavior is relentless. Work harder. Achieve more. Signal better. Outpace the person next to you. Not because you want what they have, but because you can't tolerate them having more. What makes competitive status seeking so consuming is that it's never satisfied. You beat one benchmark and the next one appears. You surpass one peer and another becomes the reference point. There's always someone richer, more successful, more admired. The competition doesn't end. It just resets with new opponents and new metrics. This affects decision-making in destructive ways. You take the job that sounds more impressive, even if it makes you miserable. You buy the thing that signals status, even if it's financially reckless. You sacrifice relationships, health, values, anything that doesn't directly contribute to being ahead. Because being ahead is the only thing that feels like winning. And anything else feels like losing. The people around competitive status seekers notice the pattern. The conversations that always turn into subtle one-upmanship. The inability to be happy for someone else's success without finding a way to compare it unfavorably to their own. The constant need to establish that they're doing better, achieving more, ranking higher. It's exhausting to be around. Because every interaction becomes a micro-competition, and the other person never agreed to play. What's particularly tragic about competitive status seeking is that it robs you of satisfaction. You achieve something genuinely meaningful, and instead of feeling proud, you feel anxious. Because the achievement only matters relative to what others have achieved. And no matter how much you accomplish, there's always someone ahead. The frame guarantees dissatisfaction. Not because you're failing, but because the definition of success is perpetually out of reach. Competitive status seeking doesn't resolve by winning. It resolves by changing the frame, by asking whether the thing you're chasing actually matters to you, or whether you're just chasing it because someone else has it. Whether being ahead makes you happy, or whether the pursuit of being ahead is just a substitute for figuring out what you actually value. Because as long as your worth depends on where you rank, you'll never have enough. Someone will always have more, and the race will never end. Status threat. A new hire joins your team. They're younger. They went to a better school. They seem effortlessly confident. And suddenly you're on edge. You're noticing every time they speak up in meetings. Every time someone laughs at their joke. Every time they get positive feedback. It's not that you dislike them. You barely know them, but their presence feels like pressure. Like something's shifting. Like your position just became less secure. A status threat is the perception that someone or something is endangering your social standing. It doesn't require an actual attack. Just the possibility. Someone new enters your space with credentials that outshine yours. A peer gets promoted when you didn't. A colleague receives praise that highlights what you lack. None of it is aimed at you. But your brain interprets it as danger anyway. The response is visceral. Your body reacts before your mind catches up. Heart rate increases. Focus narrows. Stress hormones flood your system. It's the same physiological signature as a physical threat, except there's no tiger. Just someone who might make you look less capable by comparison. What makes status threats so persistent is that they don't need to be logical. You can know intellectually that the new hire's success doesn't diminish your competence. You can recognize that your colleague's promotion wasn't about you. But the feeling doesn't care about logic. It cares about relative position. And if someone else is rising, your instinct says you're falling. Status threats trigger defensive behavior. You start competing when no competition was necessary. You downplay the other person's achievements. You find flaws in their work. You assert your own value more loudly, more often, more aggressively than the situation requires. Not because you're petty. Because your brain flagged them as a threat, and now you're defending territory you didn't realize was under attack. The damage isn't just internal. Status threats affect how you treat people. The colleague you saw as a threat becomes someone you avoid, undermine, or resent. The relationship never had a chance. You were reacting to what they represented, not who they actually were. And they probably never knew. Because status threats operate mostly below conscious awareness. You just know you feel uncomfortable around them. Tense. On guard. What makes this particularly destructive is that status threats are self-perpetuating. The more threatened you feel, the more defensively you behave. The more defensively you behave, the worse your relationships become. The worse your relationships become, the more isolated and vulnerable you feel, which makes you more sensitive to the next threat. The cycle feeds itself. Status threats don't resolve by eliminating the competition. They resolve by recognizing that most of what feels like a threat isn't actually aimed at you. Someone else's success doesn't erase yours. Someone else's recognition doesn't take yours away. The threat exists mostly in the framework you're using to interpret the situation. And that framework, the one where every gain by someone else registers as your loss, is optional. Zero-sum status belief. If your coworker gets promoted, does that make you less valuable? If your friend buys a house, does that make your apartment less yours? If someone in your field publishes something impressive, does that make your work less meaningful? Logically, no. But if you operate on zero-sum status belief, the answer feels like yes. Zero-sum thinking treats status like a fixed resource. If someone else gets more, you must have less. Their gain is your loss. Their rise is your fall. It doesn't matter that status isn't actually finite. It doesn't matter that one person's success doesn't mechanically reduce yours. The belief shapes the reaction anyway. This mindset turns every achievement around you into a personal setback. A peer's recognition isn't just their moment. It's a reminder that you weren't the one being recognized. A colleague's promotion isn't just their advancement. It's proof that you're not advancing as fast. Even when their success has nothing to do with you, zero-sum belief makes it feel like it does. The psychology behind this is rooted in comparison. Humans don't evaluate their position in absolute terms. We evaluate it relative to others. And when you believe that status is limited, relative position becomes everything. You're not asking, "Am I doing well?" You're asking, "Am I doing better than them?" And if the answer is no, it doesn't matter how well you're actually doing. You feel like you're losing. Zero-sum status belief creates a world where other people's wins are threatening. You can't celebrate a friend's success without feeling the gap between where they are and where you are. You can't acknowledge a colleague's achievement without calculating what it means for your own standing. Every positive outcome for someone else becomes a negative outcome for you, even when nothing about your situation has actually changed. This doesn't just make you miserable. It makes you hostile. You start resenting people for succeeding. You minimize their accomplishments. You find reasons why it doesn't count, why they didn't earn it, why it won't last. Not because you're cruel, but because their success feels like it's coming at your expense. And if status is zero-sum, then protecting your position means limiting theirs. The trap is that zero-sum belief becomes self-fulfilling. You treat every interaction as a competition. People notice. They pull back. They stop sharing wins with you. They stop celebrating yours. Your relationships become transactional, comparative, fragile. And now the isolation you feared is real. Not because status was actually zero-sum, but because you treated it that way until it became true. Zero-sum status belief persists because it feels true. When you see someone else get ahead, the discomfort is real. The gap is real. The comparison is real. But the belief that their gain caused your loss is not. Status isn't a pie where every slice someone takes leaves less for you. It's a perception. And perceptions can expand. But as long as you're locked into zero-sum thinking, expansion feels impossible. Every win around you just confirms what you already believed. That you're losing. Social dominance orientation. Some people are comfortable with hierarchy. They don't just accept that people are ranked differently. They think it's good, natural, the way things should be. They believe some groups deserve to be on top and others deserve to be on the bottom. And they structure their entire worldview around maintaining that order. Social dominance orientation is the psychological tendency to support and justify hierarchies. People high in this trait don't see inequality as a problem to solve. They see it as a feature of a functioning society. They believe that group-based hierarchies are inevitable, that some people are simply superior to others, and that attempting to flatten those hierarchies is both futile and wrong. This isn't the same as wanting personal success. Everyone wants to do well. Social dominance orientation is about believing that entire groups should be ranked, and that those at the top earn their place, while those at the bottom deserve to be there. It's a worldview that legitimizes inequality and resists efforts to change it. The psychology runs deep. People high in dominance orientation are drawn to competitive, zero-sum environments. They prefer systems where winning and losing are clear, where status is visible, where the hierarchy is rigid and stable. They don't want a level playing field. They want a clear pecking order. And they want to be on the winning side of it. This shapes how they see the world. When they encounter inequality, they don't see injustice. They see the natural outcome of differences in ability, effort, or worth. When they see resistance to hierarchy, they don't see people fighting for fairness. They see disorder, weakness, a refusal to accept reality. The idea that everyone should have equal opportunity, equal voice, equal value strikes them not as moral progress but as naive idealism. People with high social dominance orientation gravitate toward ideologies and institutions that reinforce hierarchy. They're more likely to support authoritarian leadership, more likely to oppose policies that redistribute resources or power, more likely to justify discrimination, not because they're consciously malicious, but because they genuinely believe that some groups are better suited to lead and others to follow. What makes this particularly insidious is that it doesn't present itself as bigotry. It presents itself as realism, as understanding how the world works, as recognizing that not everyone is equal and pretending otherwise is dishonest. The belief system wraps itself in the language of merit, competition, natural order. It frames hierarchy not as oppression but as efficiency. Social dominance orientation also affects personal relationships. People high in this trait are more comfortable with power imbalances. They don't mind being subordinate to someone they see as superior, and they don't feel guilt about dominating someone they see as inferior. Relationships become rankings. Every interaction is filtered through the question of who's above and who's below. And, once that question is answered, the treatment follows naturally. Recognizing social dominance orientation in yourself is difficult because the belief feels justified. Of course, hierarchies exist. Of course, people aren't all the same. Of course, some are more capable than others. But there's a difference between acknowledging that people have different skills and believing that people have different worth. Between recognizing hierarchies exist and believing they should. Social dominance orientation doesn't just describe the world. It defends it. And that defense, the belief that inequality is not just inevitable but right, shapes everything that follows. Reputational competition. Why does a rumor about someone spread faster than good news? Why does a minor scandal get more attention than a major accomplishment? Why do people talk more about who failed than who succeeded? Because reputation is currency. And in a world where your standing depends on how others see you, controlling the narrative about someone else is a way to manage your own position. Reputational competition is the ongoing contest to build, protect, or damage social standing through information control. It's not just about what you achieve. It's about what people believe you've achieved, and what they believe about your competitors. The game isn't played through direct confrontation. It's played through whispers, impressions, associations. Through the stories that get told when you're not in the room. The mechanism is simple. Reputation shapes opportunity. People with good reputations get trust, access, benefit of the doubt. People with damaged reputations get suspicion, exclusion, scrutiny. So managing reputation, yours and others, becomes strategic. You highlight your wins. You downplay your losses. You subtly undermine competitors by shaping how others perceive them. Not through outright lies, but through selective truth, strategic omission, carefully timed doubt. This plays out constantly in social and professional life. A colleague's mistake gets mentioned just often enough that it sticks. A competitor's success gets framed in a way that makes it seem less impressive. Your own setbacks get contextualized, explained, softened. It's not malice. It's maintenance. You're protecting your reputation by managing the information environment around you. What makes reputational competition so effective is that it operates indirectly. You're not attacking someone. You're just sharing information. You're not building yourself up. You're just correcting the record. The plausible deniability is built in. And because reputation is built on perception, not fact, small adjustments to the narrative can have outsized effects. One well-placed doubt can undo months of credibility. One unflattering association can shadow someone's accomplishments indefinitely. The cost is trust. In environments where reputational competition is intense, people become guarded. They don't share vulnerabilities. They don't admit mistakes. They don't celebrate others' wins because every win by someone else is a potential threat to their own standing. Relationships become transactional. Information becomes a weapon, and the social fabric that depends on trust, honesty, and goodwill erodes. Reputational competition also creates echo chambers of validation. You surround yourself with people who reinforce your reputation, and you reinforce theirs. You avoid people who might challenge it. The network becomes a reputation protection system, where everyone's invested in maintaining each other's standing because their own depends on it. The truth becomes secondary to the consensus. What's particularly exhausting about reputational competition is that it never stops. You can't just be good at your work. You have to make sure people know you're good. You can't just succeed. You have to make sure your success is visible, framed correctly, and not overshadowed by someone else's. The actual work becomes secondary to the performance of competence. And the performance requires constant attention. Reputational competition doesn't disappear in transparent environments. It just gets more sophisticated. The tactics shift from overt to subtle. The attacks become implications instead of accusations. The defense becomes preemptive narrative management. Because as long as reputation determines access, opportunity, and status, controlling the story will always matter more than the truth behind it. Status consumption. You don't need the luxury handbag. You don't need the designer watch. You don't need the expensive car. But you buy them anyway. Not because they function better, not because they last longer, but because of what they say about your success, your taste, your position. The object is secondary. The signal is the point. Status consumption is purchasing goods or services primarily to display wealth or social standing. It's not about utility, it's about visibility. The value of the item isn't in what it does for you. It's in what it communicates to others. That you can afford it. That you belong in circles where these things are normal. That you've arrived. The psychology is rooted in signaling. Humans use visible markers to assess each other. In a world where you can't directly observe someone's wealth, competence, or connections, objects serve as shortcuts. The brand. The price point. The exclusivity. These aren't just product features. They're data. Information about where someone ranks. And in status-conscious environments, that information matters. But here's the trap. Once everyone knows that certain items signal high status, those items become valuable precisely because they're hard to obtain. The price inflates. The access becomes restricted. The object itself becomes secondary to its scarcity. You're not buying a watch. You're buying membership in the small group of people who can afford that watch. And that membership is what actually matters. This creates an endless cycle. As more people acquire a status marker, it loses signaling power. So new markers emerge, more expensive, more exclusive, more visibly out of reach for most people. What was once a signal of success becomes common, and the bar for signaling resets higher. The competition isn't about having enough. It's about having more than the people you're comparing yourself to. Status consumption doesn't just drain resources. It distorts priorities. You're not asking what you need. You're asking what will make you look successful. You're not buying things you value. You're buying things that broadcast value. The decision-making process inverts. The question isn't, do I want this? It's, will this improve how others see me? What makes this particularly insidious is that it operates below conscious awareness. You don't think, I'm buying this to signal status. You think, I like this. This feels right. This represents who I am. But the reason it feels right is often because it carries the social weight you've internalized. The prestige. The recognition. The validation that comes from being seen with the right things. Status consumption also creates financial strain that people hide. You're spending beyond your means to maintain an image. But admitting that would undermine the very status you're trying to project. So you keep up the performance. The lifestyle looks effortless. The success looks secure, and underneath you're stretched thin, trapped in a cycle where stopping would mean omitting the image was never real. Recognizing status consumption in yourself requires honesty. To ask whether the thing you're about to buy actually serves you, or whether it's just serving your anxiety about how others perceive you. Whether you're choosing based on what you value or what you think will impress. And whether the impression you're managing is worth the cost of maintaining it. Conspicuous consumption. The car is parked where everyone can see it. The logo on the bag faces outward. The brand name is visible from across the room. This isn't accident. It's design. Because the point of buying it wasn't to have it. The point was to be seen having it. Conspicuous consumption is the practice of purchasing and displaying expensive items specifically to signal wealth and status to others. It's not about the object's function. It's about the object's visibility. The consumption is public, deliberate, designed to be noticed. And the noticing is the entire point. This isn't new. For as long as hierarchies have existed, people have displayed markers of rank, elaborate clothing, expensive ornaments, visible luxury. What's changed is the scale and the audience. Social media turned conspicuous consumption into a permanent broadcast. You're not just signaling to the people in the room. You're signaling to everyone who sees your feed. The audience is endless and the performance never stops. The psychology is straightforward. Displaying wealth signals that you have resources to spare. That you're successful enough to spend on things that aren't strictly necessary. That you belong in a certain class. And in status-conscious environments, those signals translate into social currency. People treat you differently when they perceive you as wealthy. More deference. More respect. More access. But conspicuous consumption creates a problem. It only works if the display is believable. If everyone can afford the marker, it stops signaling anything. So the items have to be expensive enough, exclusive enough, recognizable enough that most people can't have them. The signal only functions through scarcity, and that scarcity is maintained through price. This creates an arms race. You buy the item that signals status. Others notice. Some of them buy it too. The signal weakens, so you move to the next tier. More expensive, more exclusive, more visibly out of reach. The cycle repeats. And the cost of signaling keeps rising because the value isn't in the object. It's in the gap between you and everyone who can't afford it. Conspicuous consumption also distorts what people value. You're not buying things you enjoy. You're buying things other people will recognize as expensive. The private experience becomes irrelevant. The public perception becomes everything. You choose the restaurant that impresses, not the one with the best food. You buy the brand that's recognizable, not the product that's superior. The object is a prop in a performance you're giving for an audience that may not even care as much as you think they do. What makes conspicuous consumption particularly hollow is that it's never enough. You display wealth and it buys you a moment of recognition. But the recognition fades. The status marker becomes normal. And now unique thing, the next signal, the next display. The satisfaction is temporary. The need is permanent. You're not building anything. You're just maintaining an image that requires constant investment to sustain. The cruelest part of conspicuous consumption is that it traps you in a performance you can't escape. Because once you've established yourself as someone who displays wealth, stopping would signal decline. The absence of the next luxury item would be read as failure. So, you keep spending, keep displaying, keep performing, not because you want to, but because the alternative is admitting the whole thing was unsustainable from the start. And that admission, in a world that equates visible wealth with worth, feels like losing everything. Snob Effect. The brand used to be exclusive. Only a few people had it. That's why it mattered. Then it became popular. Now everyone has it. And suddenly, The people who bought it first don't want it anymore. Not because the product changed, because the scarcity disappeared. And with it, the signal. The snob effect is the decreased demand for something as it becomes more common. It's not about the object itself. It's about what owning it says. And when too many people own it, it stops saying anything worth broadcasting. The exclusivity was the value. Take that away and the appeal vanishes. This operates on a simple principle. Status goods work through differentiation. You want them because most people can't have them. The rarity is proof that you're in a select group, that you have resources, taste, or access others lack. But once the thing becomes accessible, the differentiation collapses. Now you're just like everyone else. And that's exactly what you were trying to avoid. The snob effect shows up across consumption categories. Luxury brands that become too mainstream lose their prestige buyers. Exclusive neighborhoods that attract too many newcomers lose their cake it. Niche cultural products that go viral lose their subcultural appeal. The thing hasn't gotten worse. It's just no longer rare. And rarity was the entire point. What makes this particularly revealing is that it exposes the true motivation. If you valued the product for its quality, wider availability wouldn't matter. Better access would be good news. But if you valued it for its exclusivity, wider availability is a threat. It means you can no longer use it to signal that you're different, better, part of a select few. The snob effect creates a moving target. Brands know this. As soon as a product becomes too popular, they release a more expensive, more exclusive version. Limited editions, V-tiers, members-only access. The cycle repeats at a higher price point. And the people chasing exclusivity follow, because the signal only works if it's hard to obtain. This doesn't just affect consumer goods. It affects social spaces. The restaurant that becomes too popular loses its original clientele. The vacation spot that gets discovered loses its appeal to early adopters. The cultural scene that goes mainstream loses the people who valued it for being underground. They're not looking for the best experience. They're looking for the experience that sets them apart. What's exhausting about the snob effect is that it makes satisfaction impossible. You find something you genuinely like. But if it becomes popular, you have to abandon it. Not because you stopped liking it, because liking it no longer makes you special. The thing you valued gets tainted by accessibility, and now you're searching for the next exclusive thing, knowing the cycle will just repeat. The snob effect isn't about taste. It's about distance. The need to maintain a gap between yourself and the majority. And as long as that gap is what you're really pursuing, nothing will ever be enough. Because popularity, by definition, closes the gap. And once that happens, the search begins again. Veblen Effect. The price goes up. Demand should drop. That's how it's supposed to work. But for some goods, the opposite happens. The price increases and suddenly, more people want it. Not in spite of the cost. Because of it. This is the Veblen Effect. The counterintuitive phenomenon where higher prices make certain goods more desirable. It's not that people don't understand economics. It's that they understand signaling. And for status goods, the price isn't a barrier. It's the message. The mechanism is simple. Price signals exclusivity. When something is expensive, most people can't afford it. Which means owning it proves you're not most people. You have the resources, the access, the position. The high price isn't a bug. It's the entire feature. Because a cheaper version would let anyone buy it. And if anyone can buy it, it stops being a status marker. This creates a strange market dynamic. Lower the price, and the luxury buyer loses interest. They're not buying the object. They're buying the proof that they can afford what others can't. Make it affordable, and the proof disappears. The item becomes common, functional, ordinary. Everything they were trying to distance themselves from. The Veblen Effect explains why luxury brands resist sales, discounts, and accessibility. Lowering the price might increase volume, but it destroys the signal. The people who buy at full price aren't price sensitive. They're status sensitive. They want the version that costs more specifically because it costs more. The expense is the point. This doesn't just apply to handbags and watches. It shows up in education, real estate, experiences. The most expensive school isn't necessarily the best. But the price tag signals prestige. The prettiest neighborhood isn't always the nicest. But the cost signals exclusivity. The most expensive wine isn't always the finest. But the price makes people believe it is. What makes the Veblen Effect particularly insidious is that it inverts rational decision-making. You're not asking whether something is worth the cost. You're assuming it's valuable because it costs so much. The price becomes evidence of quality, even when there's no actual correlation. Expensive equals good. Good equals expensive. The logic loops back on itself. The Veblen Effect also creates vulnerability. People who chase status through price become targets. They'll pay more for the same thing simply because the price is higher. They'll choose the expensive option even when a cheaper one is identical. The irrationality is exploitable, and entire industries are built around exploiting it. Recognizing the Veblen Effect in yourself requires honesty. To ask whether you want the thing because it's actually better, or because the price signals something you want to broadcast about yourself. Whether the cost reflects value or just scarcity. And whether you're making a choice or just performing one. Positional goods psychology. You want a house with a view. Not because the view itself matters that much, but because most houses don't have one. You want the promotion, not because the work changes significantly, but because only a few people get it. You want your child in the top school, not because the education is necessarily better, but because not everyone can get in. These are positional goods. Things whose value comes almost entirely from their relative scarcity. It's not about how good they are in absolute terms. It's about how few people have access to them. And that creates a problem. Because no matter how much wealth or achievement a society generates, positional goods stay scarce by definition. There are only so many top positions, only so many exclusive spots, only so many winners. The psychology of positional goods is rooted in comparison. A higher salary feels good not because of what it buys, but because it's higher than what others earn. A prestigious job feels valuable not because the work is fulfilling, but because few people hold that title. The good itself is secondary. The position relative to others is what actually matters. This creates a zero-sum trap. With normal goods, everyone can have more. Better technology. More food. Improved housing. Rising tides lift all boats. But with positional goods, one person's gain is another's loss. If you move up, someone else moves down. Your success requires their relative decline. The competition never resolves because the value isn't in the thing. It's in being ahead. Positional goods drive behavior that looks irrational from the outside. People work themselves to exhaustion for marginal salary increases that barely change their lifestyle. Parents spend fortunes on tutoring and test prep to get their child into a school that's only marginally better than the alternative. The effort is massive. The actual benefit is small. But the relative position is everything. What makes this particularly destructive is that it's a race no one can win. You fight for the positional good. Maybe you get it. And for a moment you're ahead. But the satisfaction is temporary. Because now you're comparing yourself to the next level. The slightly better house. The next promotion. The more exclusive circle. The positional goods never stop. There's always another tier. Always someone ahead. Always a new benchmark that resets the competition. The exhaustion comes from the fact that positional goods can't be solved through growth. You can't create more top spots without making them less valuable. You can't make everyone a winner without eliminating the meaning of winning. The scarcity is built in. And as long as you're chasing positional goods, you're stuck in a competition that, by design, most people lose. Societies organized around positional goods become treadmills. Everyone's running faster, but no one's getting ahead in aggregate. The collective effort increases. The collective satisfaction doesn't. Because for every person who moves up, someone else moves down. And the value was never in the absolute position. It was always in the gap. Recognizing positional goods means asking whether the thing you're chasing actually improves your life, or whether it just improves your rank. Whether you want it for what it is, or for what it says about where you stand. And whether the competition is worth it, knowing that even if you win, the victory just resets the race at a higher level. Merit illusion. Look at someone successful. Ask them why they made it. Most will point to hard work, talent, smart decisions. They earned it. They deserved it. And maybe they did work hard. Maybe they are talented. But the story always leaves something out. The part where luck, timing, and circumstance played a bigger role than they want to admit. The merit illusion is the belief that success is purely a product of individual ability and effort. It's the conviction that people rise and fall based on what they deserve. That the hierarchy reflects merit. That those at the top earned their place and those at the bottom failed to. It's a comforting story. It's also mostly wrong. The psychology behind this is straightforward. Successful people need to believe they earned it. Admitting that luck played a major role would undermine the meaning of their success. So they construct narratives that emphasize effort, skill, decisions. The narrative feels true because those things did matter. But it's incomplete. They remember the work. They forget the lucky break, the timely connection, the accident of being in the right place when opportunity appeared. This isn't just about individual ego. It's about system justification. If success is merit-based, then the hierarchy is fair. The people at the top deserve to be there. The people at the bottom deserve to be there too. Inequality isn't a problem to solve. It's the natural outcome of differences in ability and effort. The merit illusion transforms structural advantage into personal virtue and structural disadvantage into personal failure. But the evidence against pure meritocracy is overwhelming. Where you're born matters more than how hard you work. Who you know matters more than what you know. Timing, accidents, inheritance, discrimination, all of it shapes outcomes in ways that have nothing to do with merit. Two people with identical talent and effort will end up in vastly different places, depending on circumstances beyond their control. The merit illusion affects how people treat each other. If you believe success is earned, then unsuccessful people must have failed to earn it. They're lazy, incompetent, poor decision makers. They deserve their position, and this belief justifies indifference or even cruelty. Why help someone who's just getting what they deserve? Why redistribute resources when the current distribution already reflects merit? What makes the merit illusion particularly persistent is that it's self-reinforcing. People in power benefited from the system. They believe they earned it. So they defend the system that elevated them. They attribute their success to merit and others' lack of success to lack of merit. And because they're in power, their narrative becomes dominant. The system that produced their success gets framed as fair, and any challenge to it gets framed as an attack on merit itself. The merit illusion also traps the people who don't succeed. If you believe the system is fair and you're not succeeding, the only explanation is personal failure. You didn't work hard enough. You're not smart enough. You made bad choices. The system isn't the problem. You are. And that belief prevents you from seeing the structural barriers that actually shaped your outcome. Recognizing the merit illusion doesn't mean merit doesn't exist. Effort matters. Talent matters. But they're not the whole story. And when you treat them as if they are, you're not seeing the world clearly. You're protecting a narrative that makes success feel earned and failure feel deserved. And that narrative, comforting as it is, blinds you to how much of your position was never really in your control. Winner's halo. A CEO gives a speech. People nod along. The same person before they became CEO said similar things. No one paid attention. The ideas haven't changed. The position has. And now everything they say sounds smarter, more credible, more worth following. This is the winner's halo. The tendency to attribute positive qualities to people who've achieved high status. Once someone succeeds, we assume they're better at everything. Not just the thing they succeeded at. Everything. Their opinions carry more weight. Their advice seems wiser. Their character seems stronger. The halo from one achievement spreads to every other domain. The psychology is rooted in a shortcut. Success is visible. Competence is not. So we use success as a proxy. If someone made it to the top, they must be smart, hardworking, insightful. That's how they got there. And if they're smart about the thing that made them successful, they're probably smart about other things too. The logic feels sound, but it collapses under scrutiny. Because success doesn't prove universal competence. A brilliant engineer can be a terrible manager. A successful entrepreneur can have disastrous political opinions. A celebrated artist can be an unreliable friend. The skill that brought success in one domain doesn't transfer. But the halo does, and once it's in place, people defer to the winner even when they're speaking outside their expertise. This creates distortions. Winners get more opportunities to speak, to advise, to influence. Not because they have better ideas, because they have higher status. Their voice gets amplified. Their mistakes get excused. Their weak arguments get treated as strong ones because the person making them has already proven themselves in some other arena. The winner's halo also affects how we interpret their behavior. The same action reads differently depending on who's doing it. A high-status person is confident. A low-status person is arrogant. A winner is bold. A non-winner is reckless. The behavior is identical. The status changes the interpretation, and the interpretation reinforces the status. What makes the winner's halo particularly dangerous is that it's invisible to the people experiencing it. Winners don't realize they're being given unearned deference. They think people are responding to the quality of their ideas. So they keep talking, keep advising, keep stepping into domains where they have no expertise. And because everyone around them is nodding, they assume they're right. The halo also insulates winners from feedback. Criticism lands differently when it's directed at someone with high status. It gets softened, reframed, ignored. Winners can fail repeatedly in domains outside their expertise and still retain their halo. Because the success in their original domain is so bright, it drowns out the failures everywhere else. Recognizing the winner's halo means separating the person from their status. Asking whether the idea is good, not whether the person saying it is successful. Whether their expertise actually applies to the question at hand, not whether they've been successful at something unrelated. And whether you're deferring to the argument or just to the rank of the person making it. Lose a stigma. Someone loses their job. People start asking what went wrong. Not what happened to them. What they did wrong. They must have been underperforming. Made bad decisions. Failed to adapt. The assumption is automatic. If they lost, it's because they deserved to. This is loser stigma. The tendency to view people who fail as fundamentally flawed. It's not just about the specific failure. It's about what the failure supposedly reveals. That they're less capable, less disciplined, less worthy. One setback becomes evidence of a deeper inadequacy, and that inadequacy colors every future interaction. The psychology is rooted in attribution bias. When someone succeeds, we attribute it to their qualities. When they fail, we do the same. But we ignore the role of luck, timing, and circumstance. The successful person was talented and hardworking. The unsuccessful person was incompetent and lazy. We tell ourselves meritocracy stories because they make the world feel orderly, predictable, fair. But they're not accurate. Loser stigma shows up immediately. A person gets laid off. The network starts treating them differently. Conversations feel awkward. Invitations slow down. People distance themselves not out of cruelty but out of discomfort. The failure feels contagious. Or worse, it feels deserved. And if it's deserved, helping them feels like rewarding inadequacy. What makes loser stigma particularly cruel is that it compounds the damage. Losing a job, a relationship, a competition, those are setbacks. Painful but recoverable. But the stigma that follows makes recovery harder. People don't give you the same benefit of the doubt. Opportunities dry up. The very support you need to bounce back gets withdrawn because the failure marked you as someone not worth investing in. The stigma also becomes self-fulfilling. If people treat you like you're less competent, you start to internalize it. You second-guess yourself. You stop taking risks. You accept lower status positions because you believe that's all you deserve now. The external stigma becomes internal shame. And the shame keeps you trapped in a lower position than the one you started from. Loser stigma affects how failures are discussed. Winners get to frame their setbacks as learning experiences. Temporary obstacles on the path to eventual success. Losers don't get that narrative. Their failures are treated as endpoints. Proof that they were never good enough to begin with. The same setback reads completely differently depending on whether you bounced back or stayed down. This creates a gap in empathy. People who've never experienced significant failure don't understand how much of it is circumstance. They assume their success came from merit, and others' failures came from lack of it. They don't see the luck that kept them from failing. They only see the results. And the results, to them, prove the point. What's particularly insidious about loser stigma is that it makes status hierarchies feel justified. If failures are character flaws, then the people at the bottom deserve to be there. The system doesn't need to change. The people do. And that belief protects the status quo by framing inequality as a reflection of individual worth rather than structural design. Recognizing loser stigma means resisting the urge to explain every failure as a personal flaw. To remember that setbacks happen to capable people. That circumstance, bad luck, and timing play enormous roles. And that treating failure as proof of inadequacy says more about your need for a just world than it does about the person who failed. Status attribution bias. Someone cuts you off in traffic. You assume they're reckless, inconsiderate, a bad driver. But when you cut someone off, it's because the lane was ending, you didn't see them. The situation forced your hand. The behavior is identical. The explanation is completely different. And that difference reveals something about how you assign blame and credit based on status. Status attribution bias is the tendency to explain people's behavior differently depending on their social rank. High-status people get generous explanations. Their mistakes are circumstantial. Their successes are earned. Low-status people get harsh ones. Their mistakes are character flaws. Their successes are luck. The same action gets interpreted in opposite ways depending on who's doing it. The mechanism is rooted in assumptions. When someone has high status, you assume they're competent. So when they fail, something external must have interfered. The task was impossible. The circumstances were unfair. They were sabotaged. The failure doesn't update your view of them. It updates your view of the situation. When someone has low status, you assume they're less capable. So when they succeed, something external must have helped. They got lucky. The task was easy. Someone else did the work. The success doesn't update your view of them. It confirms your belief that they're only succeeding because the bar was low. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. High-status people get credit for successes and excuses for failures. Their reputation stays intact or improves. Low-status people get dismissed for successes and blamed for failures. Their reputation stays damaged or gets worse. The bias doesn't just describe their position, it locks it in place. Status attribution bias shows up constantly in workplace evaluations. A senior executive makes a bad call. It's framed as a bold risk that didn't pan out. A junior employee makes the same call. It's poor judgment. The executive status protects them from the full weight of the mistake. The junior's lack of status magnifies it. It happens in social settings too. A well-regarded friend cancels plans last minute. You assume something important came up. An acquaintance you don't respect does the same thing. They're flaky, unreliable. The action is the same. The interpretation changes based on how much status you've already assigned them. What makes status attribution bias particularly insidious is that it operates invisibly. You don't think, I'm excusing this because they have high status. You think, the situation explains their behavior. You don't think, I'm blaming this because they have low status. You think, their behavior reveals who they are. The bias feels like accurate perception. It's not. It's protection for people you've already decided deserve it and punishment for people you've already decided don't. Status attribution bias doesn't just affect how you see others. It affects how they see themselves. High-status people internalize the generous explanations. They believe their successes are earned and their failures are flukes. Low-status people internalize the harsh ones. They believe their failures are personal and their successes are accidents. The external bias becomes internal belief, and that belief shapes everything that follows. Status quo hierarchy bias. A company announces a reorganization. Titles shift. Reporting lines change. And almost immediately, people start resisting. Not because the new structure is worse, but because it's different. The old hierarchy felt natural. The new one feels forced. Even when the old system was clearly broken, people defend it. Because it's the system they know. Status quo hierarchy bias is the tendency to view existing social rankings as more legitimate, more natural, and more justified than alternative arrangements. It's not that people consciously believe the current system is perfect. It's that any deviation from it feels wrong, unfair, disruptive. The hierarchy that exists gets treated as the hierarchy that should exist. The psychology behind this is straightforward. Humans crave stability. Hierarchies, once established, provide predictability. You know where you stand. You know who to defer to. You know who defers to you. Changing the hierarchy disrupts that certainty. It threatens your position, even if the new system might actually benefit you. So you resist. Not because the current system is better, because it's familiar. This bias also serves a defensive function. If you've succeeded in the current system, you want to believe the system is fair. Because if it's fair, your success is earned. If it's unfair, your success is partly luck, partly structural advantage. Defending the status quo protects your self-image. It justifies your position. It frames your achievements as merit rather than circumstance. Status quo hierarchy bias makes inequality feel natural. People look at existing disparities and assume they reflect real differences in ability, effort, or value. The CEO earns more because they contribute more. The entry-level worker earns less because they contribute less. The hierarchy mirrors worth, and questioning it feels like denying reality. But hierarchies aren't natural. They're constructed. And the fact that one exists doesn't mean it's the right one. But once people internalize it, changing it feels like disruption rather than correction. Even people at the bottom of a hierarchy will defend it if it's the only one they know. Because the alternative, admitting the system that shaped their entire life was arbitrary or unjust, is too destabilizing to accept. This bias also affects how people judge reforms. A proposal to flatten hierarchy gets framed as radical. A proposal to maintain it gets framed as common sense. The burden of proof isn't equal. The challenger has to prove the new system would be better. The defender just has to point out that the current system works. And works is a low bar when people are already adapted to it. Status quo hierarchy bias becomes most visible when hierarchies shift suddenly. New leadership, new ownership, mergers. The people who benefited from the old structure resist, even when they'd benefit from the new one. Because the old hierarchy felt earned, the new one feels imposed. And the feeling of legitimacy, once a take to a system, is hard to transfer. Recognizing status quo bias means questioning whether the hierarchy you're defending actually makes sense, or whether you're just defending it because it's what you're used to. Whether the system is fair, or whether familiarity has made unfairness invisible. And whether resistance to change is about protecting something valuable, or just protecting your position in a structure you've learned to navigate. Respect-seeking. You don't need them to like you. You need them to respect you. Liking is optional. Respect is necessary. Because respect is what keeps you safe, what gets you heard, what protects your position. Without it, you're vulnerable. And in hierarchical spaces, vulnerability is dangerous. Respect-seeking is the drive to secure recognition of your competence, worth, or standing from others. It's not about friendship. It's not about warmth. It's about being taken seriously, being valued, being treated as someone whose voice matters, whose presence counts, whose position is secure. The motivation comes from a basic social fact. Respect determines treatment. People who are respected get deference. Their opinions carry weight. Their boundaries are honored. Their contributions are acknowledged. People who aren't respected get dismissed. Ignored, overridden. Disrespected people don't just feel bad. They lose access, influence, protection. This makes respect-seeking rational. You're not being shallow or status-obsessed. You're protecting yourself. In environments where being dismissed means being sidelined, where being ignored means losing opportunities, securing respect isn't vanity. It's survival. But respect-seeking creates pressure. You can't just do good work and hope people notice. You have to make sure they see it. You have to display competence visibly. Assert yourself confidently. Defend your contributions publicly. The work itself isn't enough. The performance of competence matters just as much. This shows up in how people communicate. They don't just share ideas. They frame them in ways that demonstrate expertise. They don't just ask questions. They ask questions that signal they've already thought deeply about the topic. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to earn or maintain respect. And missing that opportunity feels like losing ground. Respect-seeking also affects how people respond to challenges. A critique isn't just feedback. It's a potential threat to respect. So instead of engaging with the substance, people defend their position. Not because they're certain they're right, because conceding feels like admitting they don't deserve the respect they've built. The need to maintain respect overrides the willingness to learn. What makes respect-seeking exhausting is that respect is never fully secure. You earn it in one interaction, and then you have to earn it again in the next. One mistake, one weak moment, one instance of being overridden, and the respect you built feels like it's slipping. So you're constantly vigilant, constantly performing, constantly defending. The trap is that the more you chase respect, the more fragile it becomes. Because respect that depends on constant performance isn't stable. It's conditional, contingent on never slipping, never failing, never showing vulnerability. And that standard is impossible to maintain. So the pursuit becomes a treadmill. You're working harder and harder to secure something that feels more and more precarious. Respect-seeking doesn't disappear when you recognize it, but recognizing it creates space to ask whether you're seeking respect because you genuinely need it, or because you've tied your sense of safety to it. Whether the respect you're chasing actually protects you, or whether the chase itself is what's making you feel vulnerable. Contempt Dynamics. You see someone struggling with something you find easy. Instead of empathy, you feel disdain. They're incompetent. Slow. How are they not getting this? The contempt comes fast, automatic. And once it's there, it colors every interaction. You're not seeing a person anymore. You're seeing someone beneath you. Contempt is the emotional signature of perceived inferiority. It's not anger. Anger treats the other person as a threat. Contempt treats them as beneath consideration, unworthy of respect, undeserving of patience. And once contempt enters a relationship, it's almost impossible to remove. The psychology behind contempt is rooted in status distance. When you see someone as significantly below you in competence, worth, or standing, the gap creates a specific emotional response. Not pity, not concern. Contempt. A mixture of disgust and dismissal. The feeling that they've failed to meet a basic standard, and that failure reveals something fundamental about who they are. Contempt shows up in how you talk about people. Not just what you say, but the tone, the eye roll, the sigh, the barely concealed impatience. You're not engaging with them as equals. You're tolerating their presence. And that tolerance is thin. Every mistake they make, every question they ask, every moment they take up your time reinforces the feeling. They're not worth the effort. What makes contempt particularly corrosive is that it's contagious. Once you treat someone with contempt, they feel it. And they respond in predictable ways. They withdraw. They stop contributing. They avoid you, which gives you more evidence that they're incompetent. The contempt you displayed becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They underperform, and you use that underperformance to justify the contempt you already felt. Contempt also creates hierarchies within hierarchies. Even among peers, contempt marks who's really in and who's just tolerated. The person who gets treated with contempt might have the same title, the same salary, the same formal position. But informally, they're lower, and everyone knows it. The contempt is the signal. In relationships, contempt is a death sentence. Couples who display contempt toward each other almost never recover, because contempt doesn't leave room for repair. Anger can be worked through. Disappointment can be addressed. But contempt says, "You're beneath me. You don't deserve my respect." And once that message is sent, the foundation is gone. What makes contempt particularly insidious is that it feels justified. You're not being cruel. You're just recognizing reality. They are less competent. They are slower. They are beneath the standard. The contempt feels like an accurate assessment, not a moral failure. But feelings of contempt don't track objective competence. They track perceived status. And perceived status is shaped by bias, familiarity, and your own need to feel superior. Contempt doesn't just damage the person receiving it. It traps the person feeling it. Because once you view someone with contempt, you stop learning from them. You stop considering their perspective. You stop treating them as fully human. The relationship becomes one-dimensional. And that one-dimensionality limits you just as much as it limits them. Recognizing contempt in yourself requires honesty. To notice when impatience crosses into disdain, when frustration turns into dismissal, when you stop seeing a person and start seeing a problem, and to ask whether the contempt is revealing something about them, or something about your need to maintain distance between yourself and anyone you've decided is beneath you. Humiliation sensitivity. Someone laughs when you make a mistake. It's not cruel. It's barely noticeable, but you feel it like a punch. Your face heats up. Your chest tightens. And for the rest of the day, maybe longer, the moment replays in your head. What they think of you now. What you looked like. How exposed you felt. Humiliation sensitivity is the heightened vulnerability to experiences that threaten your social image or standing. For some people, minor embarrassments bounce off. For others, they land like wounds. A small mistake in public, a critique delivered in front of others, a moment of incompetence that someone witnessed. These aren't just uncomfortable. They're devastating. The psychology is rooted in status threat. Humiliation isn't private shame. It's public exposure. It's the moment when your inadequacy, real or perceived, becomes visible to others. And if others see it, they can use it. To lower your standing. To question your competence. To mark you as someone who doesn't belong. For humiliation-sensitive people, that possibility feels catastrophic. This sensitivity creates hypervigilance. You're constantly monitoring for potential humiliation. Scanning interactions for signs that you're about to be exposed. Avoiding situations where you might make a mistake in front of others. The world becomes a minefield. Every social interaction carries the risk of humiliation. And the fear of that risk shapes every decision. Humiliation-sensitive people avoid taking risks that others wouldn't think twice about. Speaking up in meetings. Trying something new in public. Admitting they don't know something, because the potential for humiliation outweighs the potential benefit. Better to stay silent than risk looking foolish. Better to avoid the situation than risk exposure. What makes humiliation sensitivity particularly painful is that the moments replay. A humiliating experience doesn't just hurt in the moment. It echoes. You relive it. Analyze it. Imagine what others must think of you now. The actual event might have been minor. But in your mind, it becomes proof of inadequacy. Evidence that you don't measure up. A permanent mark on your social record. This sensitivity also affects relationships. You become defensive. Interpreting neutral feedback as criticism. Treating constructive suggestions as attacks. Because anything that implies you're less than perfect feels like humiliation waiting to happen. So you protect yourself. You deflect. You avoid vulnerability, and the relationships suffer because you can't let anyone see you struggle. Humiliation sensitivity often comes from past experiences. A history of being mocked, dismissed, or publicly shamed. The sensitivity isn't irrational. It's learned. Your brain is protecting you from repeating an experience that was genuinely painful. But the protection becomes a prison, because avoiding all risk of humiliation means avoiding all risk. And avoiding risk means stagnation. The trap is that the more sensitive you are to humiliation, the more you create conditions for it. You avoid situations where you might grow. You don't develop skills that require visible practice. You don't take opportunities that involve learning in public. And the gap between where you are and where others are widens, which makes future humiliation more likely. The sensitivity you're trying to protect yourself with becomes the thing that traps you in place. Recognizing humiliation sensitivity means separating the feeling from the reality. Asking whether the moment that felt humiliating was actually as significant as it felt. Whether others noticed or cared as much as you think they did. And whether the fear of future humiliation is protecting you or just keeping you from becoming someone who's less afraid. Narcissistic rivalry. They got recognized. You didn't. And instead of feeling disappointed, you feel threatened. It's not about the recognition itself. It's about what it means. They're ahead, which means you're behind. And being behind, even by a fraction, feels intolerable. So the focus shifts. Not to improving yourself, to diminishing them. Narcissistic rivalry is the competitive, hostile response to perceived threats to superiority. It's not the same as healthy competition. Healthy competition motivates you to improve. Narcissistic rivalry motivates you to tear others down. Because their success isn't just their win. It's your loss. And the only way to restore balance is to make sure they lose too. The psychology stems from a fragile sense of superiority. Narcissistic rivals need to see themselves as better than others. Not just good. Better. The comparison is essential. But that means their self-worth depends on maintaining the gap. And anyone who threatens the gap becomes a target. Narcissistic rivalry shows up in how people react to others' success. A colleague gets promoted. Instead of congratulating them, you find reasons why it doesn't count. They got lucky. The decision was political. They don't deserve it. The goal isn't to feel better about your own position. It's to devalue theirs. Because if their success doesn't count, the gap hasn't closed. This creates a hostile environment. Narcissistic rivals don't collaborate. They compete. They don't share credit. They hoard it. They don't celebrate others' wins. They minimize them. Every interaction becomes a zero-sum game, and anyone who rises becomes a threat that needs to be managed, undermined, or eliminated. What makes narcissistic rivalry particularly destructive is that it's never satisfied. You diminish one rival, and another emerges. You prove yourself superior in one domain, and someone else succeeds in another. The threat is constant because the need for superiority is insatiable. There's always someone who might be better. And that possibility is unbearable. Narcissistic rivalry also distorts self-perception. Rivals spend so much energy focused on others that they lose track of their own goals. They're not asking, "What do I want to achieve?" They're asking, "How do I stay ahead of them?" Their entire trajectory becomes reactive, shaped by what others are doing rather than by what they actually value. The relationships around narcissistic rivals deteriorate fast. People notice the hostility, the constant need to compete, the inability to celebrate anyone else's success, and they pull back. Not because the rival isn't talented, but because the rivalry makes every interaction feel like a battle. And most people don't want to spend their energy managing someone else's fragile ego. What's particularly tragic about narcissistic rivalry is that it's rooted in insecurity masquerading as confidence. The need to be better than others isn't strength. It's a defense against the fear of being ordinary. And that defense requires constant vigilance, constant competition, constant hostility, which means the rival never gets to enjoy their own achievements. They're too busy making sure no one else's achievements threaten their position. Recognizing narcissistic rivalry in yourself means noticing when someone else's success triggers hostility instead of inspiration. When your first response to their win is to find reasons it doesn't matter. When you're more focused on their position than your own. And asking whether the rivalry is driving you towards something you want, or just driving you away from the fear of being less than someone else. Social rank theory. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like defeat. Like you've lost a competition you didn't know you were in. You're not mourning a specific loss. You're responding to a signal your brain keeps sending. You're low in the hierarchy. You don't belong. You should withdraw. Social rank theory suggests that much of what we call depression is actually an involuntary subordination response. Your brain detects that you're losing status, failing to compete, being excluded from valued groups. And it responds by shutting you down, reducing your energy, lowering your mood, making you want to withdraw. It's not a malfunction. It's an ancient adaptation that, in the modern world, misfires constantly. The evolutionary logic is clear. In small social groups, losing rank was dangerous. If you kept competing after you'd already lost, you risked retaliation from higher status individuals. Better to accept defeat, signal submission, withdraw from competition, wait until circumstances changed. The subordination response kept you alive by making continued competition feel impossible. But that same response in modern hierarchies becomes chronic. You're not losing one competition. You're losing dozens simultaneously. Career, social standing, financial security, physical appearance. Every domain has a hierarchy, and in every one there are visible winners and visible losers. Your brain tracks all of it, and when the losses accumulate, the subordination response kicks in. This shows up as what clinicians call depression, but the symptoms map perfectly onto subordination. Low energy, reduced motivation, social withdrawal, negative self-evaluation. These aren't random. They're the behavioral signature of an organism that's detected it's at the bottom and needs to stop competing before it gets hurt. What makes social rank theory particularly compelling is that it explains why status threats trigger depressive episodes. Losing a job, ending a relationship, failing publicly. These aren't just stressful events, they're rank losses. And rank losses activate the subordination response. Your brain isn't broken. It's responding to the signal that you're losing position and need to retreat. The problem is that modern life creates constant rank comparisons. Social media, professional networks, endless visibility into how everyone else is doing. Your brain is running subordination calculations non-stop, comparing your position to an infinite number of others. And when you're always comparing, you're always finding someone ahead, which means the subordination response never fully turns off. Social rank theory also explains why antidepressants often work. They don't fix the hierarchy. They change how your brain responds to losing position. The status threat is still there, but the subordination response becomes less automatic. You can keep competing even when you're behind. The medication doesn't change the world. It changes how defeat registers. Recognizing social rank dynamics in depression doesn't eliminate the pain, but it reframes it. You're not fundamentally broken. You're responding to signals about position and belonging. And those signals, in a world of constant comparison and visible hierarchy, are overwhelming a system that evolved for much smaller, more stable groups. Prestige vulnerability. You've built a reputation. People respect you. They seek your advice. They treat you like you know what you're talking about. And then someone challenges you. Not aggressively. Just a simple question. A different perspective. And instead of engaging, you feel panic. Because if you're wrong about this, what else are you wrong about? If they stop respecting you here, do they stop respecting you everywhere? Prestige vulnerability is the fragility that comes with status built on perceived expertise. You're not powerful through force. You're influential through respect. And respect is conditional. It depends on people believing you're competent, knowledgeable, trustworthy. The moment that belief cracks, your position collapses. So you defend it. Not because you're certain you're right. Because uncertainty feels like loss. The psychology is straightforward. Prestige is earned through demonstrated value. You know things others don't. You solve problems others can't. You provide insights that prove useful. That competence builds trust. And trust builds influence. But the same mechanism that elevates you also makes you vulnerable. Because the competence is always being evaluated. And one visible failure can undo years of credibility. This creates defensiveness. Someone points out a mistake. Instead of thanking them, you explain why it's not really a mistake. Someone challenges your reasoning. Instead of considering their point, you find flaws in their argument. You're not protecting the idea. You're protecting the reputation that the idea represents. Because if you're wrong, people might stop listening. And if they stop listening, you lose the prestige that defines your position. Prestige vulnerability shows up most clearly in people whose status depends entirely on being right. Academics, consultants, thought leaders. Their value is their expertise. If the expertise is questioned, the value is questioned. So they can't afford to be wrong. Or more accurately, they can't afford to be seen being wrong. The error itself isn't the threat. The visibility is. This creates a trap. The more prestige you accumulate, the harder it becomes to admit uncertainty, because uncertainty undermines the very thing people value you for. You're supposed to know. You're supposed to have answers. Saying, "I don't know," or "I was wrong," feels like reputational suicide, so you double down. You defend positions past the point of reason. Not because you're stubborn, because your status depends on being right. What makes prestige vulnerability particularly exhausting is that it requires constant performance. You can't have an off day. You can't make casual mistakes. Every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce or damage your reputation. So you're always on. Always careful. Always aware that one slip could undermine everything you've built. The irony is that the vulnerability often comes from the very competence that earned the prestige. You are knowledgeable. You are skilled. But the need to protect that image prevents you from growing. Because growth requires admitting you don't know. It requires trying things you might fail at. It requires being wrong in visible ways. And when your status depends on appearing infallible, growth becomes too risky. Prestige vulnerability doesn't resolve by accumulating more prestige. It resolves by recognizing that the image you're defending is already a performance. That everyone, including you, has limits. And that admitting those limits doesn't destroy credibility. It often builds it. Because people trust someone who's right most of the time and honest about the rest more than someone who's never wrong, because they never admit error. Recognition hunger. You post something online. The likes come in slowly. You check again. Refresh. Check again. It's not that you need validation. You tell yourself that. But the absence of it feels like silence. Like you said something and no one heard. Like you're invisible. And the invisibility stings more than you want to admit. Recognition hunger is the chronic need for external acknowledgement of your worth, contributions, or existence. It's not about being famous. It's about being seen. About having proof that you matter. That what you do registers. That you're not just passing through unnoticed. The drive for recognition is ancient. In small groups, being recognized meant being valued. Being valued meant being protected, included, resourced. Invisibility was dangerous. It meant you were marginal, expendable. So the need for recognition wasn't vanity. It was survival. Your brain learned to crave the signal that you belonged. But modern life has distorted the feedback loop. You're not in a small group anymore. You're in an infinite audience. And the signals that used to confirm belonging, acknowledgement from people who know you, have been replaced by metrics from strangers. Likes, views, followers. The numbers become the proof. And when the numbers are low, it feels like rejection. Like you don't matter. Recognition hunger creates a dependency. You start shaping your actions around what will get noticed. You don't just do good work. You do visible work. You don't just help people. You help people in ways that can be acknowledged publicly. The intrinsic value of the action becomes secondary to the recognition it might generate. And if it doesn't generate recognition, it feels wasted. This shows up in how people talk about their achievements. They're not satisfied with private success. They need others to know. They need the acknowledgement, the celebration, the validation that what they did mattered. And when that validation doesn't come, the success feels hollow, because the recognition was the point. What makes recognition hunger particularly painful is that it's never satisfied. You get recognized once. It feels good, for a moment. Then it fades. And now you need more. The next post. The next achievement. The next moment of visibility. The hunger doesn't decrease with feeding. It intensifies. Because the recognition isn't filling a need. It's masking an insecurity. And no amount of external validation can fix an internal sense of worthlessness. Recognition hunger also affects relationships. People become performative. They share carefully curated versions of their lives designed to maximize acknowledgement. They avoid vulnerability because it might not get liked. They stop being authentic because authenticity doesn't always get recognized. And the relationships that form around the performance are shallow. Because no one's connecting with the real person. They're connecting with the version designed to be seen. The trap is that recognition hunger makes you dependent on others for something they can never reliably provide. Because recognition is fickle. People's attention shifts. Algorithms change. What got noticed yesterday gets ignored today. And if your sense of worth depends on being recognized, you're always at the mercy of an audience that doesn't owe you anything. Recognizing recognition hunger in yourself means noticing when the absence of acknowledgement feels like rejection. When doing something well isn't enough unless others see it. When your mood depends on how many people noticed what you did. And asking whether you're seeking recognition because you value connection or because you need constant proof that you exist. Upward comparison stress. Your friend just bought a house. You're still renting. They post pictures. Beautiful light. Hardwood floors. Space. And you're happy for them. You are. But underneath the happiness, there's tightness. A voice asking why you're not there yet. What you're doing wrong. Why their timeline is ahead of yours. Upward comparison stress is the psychological strain that comes from measuring yourself against people who are ahead of you. It's not the comparison itself that hurts. It's the conclusion you draw from it, that you're behind, that you're not doing enough, that something about you is insufficient. And that conclusion sits in your chest like weight. Upward comparisons are supposed to be motivating. See someone ahead, work harder, catch up. That's the logic. But in practice, they're often just demoralizing, because the gap feels too large. The person ahead had advantages you didn't, or they got lucky, or the path they took isn't available to you. So instead of motivation, you get stress. The stress of falling short, of not measuring up, of being left behind. The psychology is rooted in relative evaluation. You don't experience your life in absolute terms. You experience it relative to others. And when you compare up to people doing better, earning more, achieving faster, the relativity makes your own position feel worse. Not because your situation changed, because the reference point did. Upward comparison stress is amplified by visibility. You see your peers' wins constantly. Social media makes every achievement public. Every promotion, every milestone, every upgrade. And each one is a data point in the comparison, a reminder of where you're not. The frequency of exposure turns occasional envy into chronic inadequacy. What makes upward comparison stress particularly destructive is that it's self-reinforcing. You feel behind, so you push harder. But pushing harder without changing strategy just leads to burnout. You're working more, sleeping less, sacrificing relationships, all to close a gap that might not even be real. Because the person you're comparing yourself to might be struggling too. But you only see their wins, and they only see yours. Upward comparison stress also distorts priorities. You start chasing things you don't actually want because someone else has them. The bigger title, the nicer car, the impressive credential. Not because these things serve your goals, because having them would close the gap. And closing the gap feels like the only way to stop feeling inadequate. The trap is that there's always someone ahead. You catch up to one benchmark, and the next one appears. Your friend buys a house. You buy a house. Now your friend renovates. You renovate. Now your friend's kid gets into a top school. The comparisons never end because the hierarchy is infinite. And as long as you're comparing up, you'll always find someone doing better. Which means the stress never resolves. Upward comparison stress doesn't disappear by achieving more. It disappears by changing the frame. By asking whether the person you're comparing yourself to is actually living a life you want, or just a life that looks impressive. Whether the gap you're trying to close actually matters to you, or whether you're just trying to stop feeling less than. Because as long as your worth depends on where you rank relative to others, someone else's success will always feel like your failure. Downward comparison relief. You're having a bad day. Then you see someone else having a worse one, and something shifts. You're not happy they're struggling, but you feel better about your own situation. Lighter. Because at least you're not them. At least you're not that far down. Downward comparison relief is the emotional comfort that comes from seeing others in positions worse than your own. It's not about schadenfreude. You're not celebrating their misfortune. You're just using their position to recalibrate your sense of where you stand. And standing above someone, even in hardship, feels better than standing alone in it. The psychology is rooted in relative positioning. When you're struggling, comparing yourself to people doing better makes it worse. You feel even more behind. But comparing yourself to people doing worse provides relief. You might not be thriving, but you're not at the bottom. And not being at the bottom in hierarchical terms is a form of success. Downward comparisons happen automatically. You lose your job. You see someone who's been unemployed longer. You feel less bad. Your relationship ends. You hear about someone's messier breakup. Yours feels more manageable. You're not consciously seeking out others' misfortune. But when you encounter it, it serves a function. It makes your own position feel less dire. What makes downward comparison relief particularly revealing is that it exposes how much of your emotional state depends on relative position rather than absolute conditions. You might be in the exact same situation, same struggles, same setbacks, but how you feel about it changes completely based on who you're comparing yourself to. If you're comparing up, you feel worse. If you're comparing down, you feel better. The situation hasn't changed. The frame has. Downward comparison relief also explains why people sometimes resist others' success. If someone below you rises, they're no longer available as a source of relief. The comfort you got from being ahead of them disappears. And now you have one less person to compare down to, which makes your own position feel more precarious. It's not that you want them to fail, but their success removes a buffer that was making you feel better about where you are. This creates a dark incentive. If downward comparisons provide relief, then maintaining a gap between yourself and others below you feels protective. You don't want them to close the distance, because the distance is what's making you feel secure. So you might, consciously or not, resist their progress. Not because you're malicious, because their rise threatens the relief their position was providing. What's particularly uncomfortable about downward comparison relief is that it makes your emotional well-being dependent on others staying down. You feel better when they're worse off, not because their position affects yours materially, but because it affects it psychologically. And that dependence, the need for someone to be beneath you so you can feel okay, reveals how fragile your sense of worth actually is. Downward comparison relief doesn't resolve by finding people worse off than you. It resolves by detaching your emotional state from relative position entirely. By recognizing that someone else's struggle doesn't make yours easier. Someone else's failure doesn't make you more successful. And the relief you get from comparing down is temporary, hollow, and ultimately just another way of outsourcing your sense of worth to a hierarchy that will never stop shifting. Symbolic status markers. The degree on the wall, the brand on the bag, the title on the business card, the car in the driveway. None of these things change who you are, but all of them change how people see you. And how people see you changes everything. Symbolic status markers are objects, credentials, or affiliations that signal social rank without directly demonstrating competence or value. They're shortcuts. Visual cues that tell others where you fit in the hierarchy. And because humans process status quickly, these markers shape interactions before a word is spoken. The function is efficiency. You can't evaluate everyone you meet from scratch. You don't have time, so you rely on markers. The expensive watch suggests resources. The prestigious degree suggests competence. The recognizable brand suggests taste. The markers do the work of establishing position so the interaction can proceed with roles already understood. But symbolic status markers create a gap between appearance and reality. The person with the degree might not be smart. The person with the expensive car might be drowning in debt. The person with the impressive title might be incompetent. The marker signals status, but it doesn't guarantee the substance the status is supposed to represent. This creates a market for markers. People buy, display, and accumulate symbols not because they need the object, but because they need the signal. The handbag doesn't carry things better than a cheaper one, but it signals something the cheaper one doesn't. And that signal in status-conscious environments has value. It changes how you're treated, how seriously you're taken, what opportunities come your way. Symbolic status markers also create hierarchies within hierarchies. It's not enough to have a degree. It has to be from the right school. It's not enough to have a title. It has to be at the right company. It's not enough to have nice things. They have to be the right brands. The markers themselves get ranked, and the ranking determines how much status they actually confer. What makes symbolic markers particularly powerful is that they're visible and verifiable. You can't easily prove you're smart in a brief interaction, but you can wear a logo, mention a credential, drop a recognizable affiliation. The marker does the proving for you. It vouches for you before you've said anything of substance. But reliance on symbolic markers creates fragility. If your status depends on markers, then losing the marker means losing the status. The job title changes. The status drops. The expensive object becomes outdated. The status fades. You're not building a position based on who you are. You're renting it based on what you display. And the rent is constant. Symbolic status markers also trap people in performative consumption. You're not buying what you want. You're buying what signals the position you're trying to maintain. And maintaining that position requires constant investment. New markers. Updated signals. Keeping up with the shifting standards of what counts as high status. The performance never ends because the markers are always being recalibrated. Recognizing symbolic status markers means seeing them for what they are. Signals, not substance. Shortcuts, not proof. And asking whether the markers you're pursuing actually represent something you value, or whether you're just collecting symbols because you've tied your worth to what they supposedly say about you. Status defense. Someone criticizes your work. It's constructive, specific, probably accurate, but instead of considering it, you're already building a defense. The criticism isn't about the work anymore. It's about your position. Because if they're right and you were wrong, what does that say about where you stand? So you defend. Not the idea. The status the idea represents. Status defense is the reflexive protection of social standing when it feels threatened. It's not about truth. It's not about improvement. It's about maintaining position. Because in hierarchical environments, admitting error feels like losing ground. And losing ground feels dangerous. So you protect yourself, even when protection means rejecting feedback that could actually help. The mechanism is automatic. Criticism registers as a status threat. Your brain doesn't process it as information. It processes it as an attack on your standing. And attacks trigger defense. You deflect. You explain. You find flaws in the critic's argument. You shift blame. Anything to avoid the implication that you're less competent than your position suggests. Status defense shows up most visibly when the stakes are lowest. A minor mistake. A small oversight. Something easily corrected. But the response is disproportionate. Because it's not about the mistake. It's about what admitting the mistake would signal. That you're fallible. That your judgment isn't perfect. That maybe you don't deserve the respect you've been getting. This creates a trap. The more you defend your status, the more you broadcast insecurity. People notice. They see someone who can't handle feedback, who treats every critique as an existential threat, who's more interested in being right than in being accurate. And that perception damages your standing more than the original error ever would have. Status defense also prevents growth. You can't learn if you can't admit you were wrong. You can't improve if every suggestion feels like an attack. The feedback that could help you becomes the enemy. And you spend your energy protecting a position that's becoming increasingly fragile because you're not allowing yourself to strengthen it. What makes status defense particularly exhausting is that it requires constant vigilance. Every interaction is a potential threat. Every question could be a challenge. Every disagreement could undermine your position. So you're always ready, always defensive, always protecting. And the protection becomes a prison. The irony is that the people most secure in their status don't need to defend it. They can admit error because one mistake doesn't define them. They can accept feedback because criticism doesn't threaten their position. Status defense is a signal of fragility, not strength. And the more aggressively you defend, the clearer it becomes that the status you're protecting was never as solid as you needed it to be. Elitism. Some people don't just think they're better. They think they belong to a category of better, a select group, the educated, the cultured, the informed. Everyone outside that group isn't just different, they're lesser. And that distinction isn't accidental, it's essential. Because being part of the elite only matters if most people aren't. Elitism is the belief that certain groups are inherently superior and deserve privilege, influence, or resources that others don't. It's not just about individual achievement. It's about group membership. And the boundaries of that membership are carefully maintained. Because if everyone can join, the elite stops being elite. The psychology is rooted in identity. Elites define themselves by distinction. They're not like everyone else. They have refined taste, superior judgment, access to knowledge or experiences that others lack, and that distinction creates a sense of belonging to something exclusive, something valuable precisely because it's rare. Elitism shows up in how people talk about education, culture, taste. They don't just prefer certain things. They treat those preferences as markers of intelligence or sophistication. If you don't appreciate the right art, read the right books, hold the right opinions, you're not just different. You're uncultured, unsophisticated, outside the circle that matters. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Elites surround themselves with other elites. They consume the same media, attend the same institutions, reference the same cultural touchstones, and this shared experience becomes proof of their superiority. They're not biased. They're just recognizing quality, and the fact that most people don't recognize it just confirms that most people aren't capable of recognizing it. Elitism also justifies inequality. If the elite are genuinely superior, then their advantages are deserved. They should have more influence, more resources, more power. Not because the system is rigged in their favor, because they're simply better equipped to use those things well. The inequality isn't a problem. It's a reflection of natural hierarchy. What makes elitism particularly insidious is that it masquerades as meritocracy. Elites believe they earned their position through talent and effort. They worked hard. They cultivated their abilities. They made good choices. The fact that they started with advantages, connections, and access that others didn't have gets erased from the story. Their position becomes proof of their merit. And anyone who didn't reach the same position must lack that merit. Elitism also creates contempt for the majority. If you're part of a superior group, everyone outside it is, by definition, inferior. Their opinions matter less. Their experiences are less valid. Their struggles are less important. Not because elites are consciously cruel, but because the entire framework depends on the distinction, on being better than. And you can't maintain that distinction while treating others as equals. The trap is that elitism requires constant maintenance. The boundaries have to be policed. The markers have to be updated. The distinction has to be reinforced. Because if the elite becomes too accessible, it stops being elite. So elites spend enormous energy protecting exclusivity. Not because exclusivity serves a function, but because without it the identity collapses. Moral superiority belief. Why do people think they're more ethical than everyone else? Not more successful, not smarter, more moral, more principled, more on the right side of history. It's not that they're consciously arrogant. They genuinely believe it. And that belief shapes everything. Who they listen to, who they dismiss, who deserves their respect and who doesn't. Moral superiority belief is the conviction that your values, judgments, and actions are more ethical than those of others. It's not about having values. Everyone has values. It's about the certainty that yours are correct and others are deficient. That you see clearly while others are confused, biased, or morally compromised. The psychology behind this is rooted in motivated reasoning. You evaluate your own actions generously. You know your intentions. You understand the context. You see the complexity. So when you make a choice, even a questionable one, you can explain why it was the right thing to do. But when others make similar choices, you don't have that context. You only see the action. And without the generous interpretation you give yourself, their behavior looks worse. This asymmetry creates the illusion of moral superiority. Your moral missteps are exceptions, mistakes made under pressure, understandable given the circumstances. Their moral missteps are character revelations, proof of who they really are. You judge yourself by your best intentions. You judge them by their worst actions. And the comparison makes you look better every time. Moral superiority belief also serves a social function. It justifies your position and your choices. If you're more moral, then the people who agree with you are more moral too. And the people who disagree aren't just wrong. They're morally inferior. This turns every disagreement into a moral contest. And moral contests don't invite dialogue. They invite dismissal. What makes moral superiority belief particularly destructive is that it's self-sealing. Any evidence that you might be wrong gets reinterpreted as proof that you're right. If someone criticizes your behavior, it's because they don't understand ethics like you do. If your actions hurt someone, it's because they're too sensitive or too biased to see your good intentions. The belief protects itself by delegitimizing any challenge to it. Moral superiority belief also corrodes relationships. People sense when you see yourself as morally above them, and they pull back. Not because they're defensive, because being around someone who constantly signals their moral superiority is exhausting. Every conversation becomes an opportunity for judgment. Every mistake becomes evidence of moral failure. And no one wants to be perpetually evaluated by someone who's already decided they're better. The irony is that moral superiority belief often accompanies moral blindness. The more certain you are of your own ethics, the less likely you are to examine your actual behavior. You're so focused on being on the right side, holding the right positions, aligning with the right causes, that you stop noticing when your actions contradict your values. The belief in your superiority becomes a substitute for the work of actually being ethical. Recognizing moral superiority belief in yourself means noticing when you're more focused on being right than on being good. When you're more interested in condemning others' moral failures than examining your own. When disagreement feels like moral deficiency rather than different perspective. And asking whether your certainty about your own ethics is making you better, or just making you more comfortable with not questioning yourself. Hierarchy internalization. You learned early that some people matter more than others. Teachers mattered more than students. Adults more than children. People with titles more than people without them. And somewhere along the way, You stop questioning it. The hierarchy stopped being something imposed from outside. It became the way you see the world. Natural. Inevitable. Just how things are. Hierarchy internalization is the process by which external social rankings become internal beliefs about how the world should be organized. You don't just observe that hierarchies exist. You come to believe they're correct. That the people at the top deserve to be there. That the people at the bottom belong there. That challenging the structure isn't progress. It's chaos. The psychology begins in childhood. You grow up inside hierarchies. Family. School. Community. And these hierarchies teach you how to navigate the world. Who to defer to. Who to obey. Who has authority and who doesn't. At first, it's just survival. You follow the rules because breaking them has consequences. But over time, the rules stop feeling arbitrary. They start feeling right. This internalization is reinforced constantly. The people at the top get validated. Their decisions are treated as important. Their opinions carry weight. The people at the bottom get dismissed. Their contributions are overlooked. Their voices don't matter. And you absorb the message. Status isn't just about power. It's about worth. The hierarchy reflects something real about who deserves respect and who doesn't. Once internalized, hierarchies become invisible. You don't see them as constructed. You see them as natural. Of course, managers make more than workers. Of course, people with degrees get more respect than people without them. Of course, some voices are louder than others. That's just how competence and value distribute themselves. The hierarchy isn't maintaining itself through power. It's just reflecting reality. Hierarchy internalization also affects how you see yourself. You locate yourself in the hierarchy and accept that position as valid. If you're high, you deserve it. If you're low, you probably deserve that too. The ranking isn't something to resist. It's something to accept. And that acceptance makes you complicit in maintaining the very structure that might be limiting you. What makes internalized hierarchy particularly powerful is that it doesn't feel like belief. It feels like perception. Like you're just seeing the world clearly. When someone challenges the hierarchy, they're not offering a different perspective. They're denying reality. And denying reality feels dangerous, disorienting, wrong. So you defend the hierarchy, not because you benefit from it, because it's the only framework you have for making sense of the world. Internalized hierarchy also creates resistance to change. Even when the existing structure is clearly unfair, flattening it feels threatening. Because the hierarchy isn't just about who has power. It's about identity. If you've built your sense of self around your position in the hierarchy, changing the hierarchy changes who you are. And that's terrifying. Easier to keep the structure intact, even if it's unjust, than to face the disorientation of rebuilding your understanding of the world. Recognizing hierarchy internalization means asking whether the rankings you see as natural are actually inevitable. Whether the people at the top are there because they're genuinely more valuable, or because the system was designed to elevate certain people and suppress others. And whether your acceptance of the hierarchy is based on evidence, or just on the fact that you've been inside it so long you can't imagine anything else. Prestige fragility. You spent years building your reputation. Published. Spoke. Taught. People sought your expertise. Your name carried weight. And now, one misstep, one bad take, one public disagreement, and you can feel it slipping. The respect you earn doesn't feel solid anymore. It feels breakable. And the possibility of it breaking keeps you up at night. Prestige fragility is the brittleness of status built on reputation rather than power. You don't control resources. You don't command authority through force. Your influence comes from being respected. And respect, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. So you protect it, carefully. Constantly, knowing that one wrong move could undo years of credibility. The psychology is rooted in the nature of prestige itself. Unlike dominance, which is maintained through coercion, prestige is maintained through perception. People defer to you because they believe you're competent, knowledgeable, trustworthy. But beliefs are fragile. One visible failure can shatter them. One inconsistency can raise doubt. And once doubt enters, prestige starts to erode. This creates hypervigilance. You can't afford to be wrong publicly. You can't afford to look incompetent. You can't afford moments of uncertainty, because each of those chips away at the perception that built your prestige. So you avoid risk. You stay in domains where you're confident. You don't venture into areas where you might look foolish. The caution that protects your reputation also limits your growth. Prestige fragility shows up in how people respond to challenges. A colleague questions your analysis. Instead of engaging openly, you feel threat. Because if they're right and you're wrong, the damage isn't just to the argument. It's to the credibility that your entire position depends on. So you defend harder than the situation warrants. You dismiss the challenge. You protect the reputation at the cost of the truth. What makes prestige fragility particularly painful is that it increases with success. The more prestige you accumulate, the more you have to lose. Early in your career, a mistake is a learning moment. Later, a mistake is a credibility crisis. The higher you climb, the more fragile your position becomes, because the fall is further and the audience watching is larger. Prestige fragility also creates isolation. You can't be vulnerable with people who see you as an expert. You can't admit uncertainty. You can't ask basic questions, because vulnerability undermines the image that your prestige depends on. So you maintain the performance. Always competent. Always certain. Always in control. And the performance separates you from the connections that might actually support you. The trap is that protecting prestige often damages it. The refusal to admit error makes you seem rigid. The defensiveness makes you seem insecure. The avoidance of risk makes you seem stagnant. You're trying to preserve credibility by never showing weakness, but the preservation strategy broadcasts exactly the fragility you're trying to hide. Prestige fragility doesn't resolve by accumulating more prestige. It resolves by recognizing that prestige built on the illusion of infallibility was always fragile. That real credibility comes from being right most of the time and honest about the rest. That people trust someone who admits limits more than someone who pretends not to have any. And that the reputation you're protecting so carefully might actually be stronger if you stop treating it like glass. Worth contingent on rank. Your value as a person shouldn't depend on where you stand in the hierarchy. But it does. At least it feels like it does. When you're ahead, you feel valuable, confident, worthy. When you fall behind, those feelings evaporate. You're not just lower in the ranking. You're less. And that sense of being less doesn't come from outside. It comes from the belief you've internalized, that your worth is your rank. Worth contingent on rank is the psychological state where self-esteem and identity are tied to social position. You don't have intrinsic value. You have positional value. And that value fluctuates with every shift in the hierarchy. Every promotion, every setback, every comparison. Your sense of who you are depends entirely on where you stand relative to others. The mechanism is simple but devastating. If your worth is your rank, then protecting your rank becomes protecting your identity. Losing position isn't just a practical problem. It's an existential one. You're not just less successful. You're less worthwhile as a human being. And that equation makes every status threat feel like a threat to your core self. This belief shapes everything. How you choose jobs. Not based on what you'd enjoy, but on what signals higher status. How you treat people. Those above you get deference. Those below you get dismissal. Because the hierarchy isn't just about position. It's about worth. And treating someone as an equal when they're lower in rank would contradict the belief that rank determines value. Worth contingent on rank also creates desperation. You can't afford to lose position, because losing position means losing yourself, so you compete ruthlessly. You undermine peers. You take credit you didn't earn. You protect your standing at all costs, not because you're ambitious, because your sense of being a worthwhile person depends on staying ahead, and falling behind feels like ceasing to exist. What makes this particularly tragic is that it's a trap with no exit. You reach a higher rank. For a moment, you feel valuable. Then the relief fades, because now you're comparing yourself to the next level. And relative to them, you're still behind. The finish line keeps moving, and your worth keeps depending on reaching it. So the chase never ends, the validation never lasts, and the sense of worthlessness always returns. Worth contingent on rank also makes relationships impossible. You can't connect with people as equals if you're constantly evaluating who's above and who's below. You can't be vulnerable if vulnerability signals low status. You can't celebrate others' success if their rise threatens your sense of worth. Every interaction becomes a status calculation, and the calculations crowd out everything else. The belief also creates a cruel irony. The more your worth depends on rank, the more fragile your self-esteem becomes. Because rank is unstable. It shifts. It's vulnerable to circumstances you can't control. So you've tied your value as a person to something that can be taken away at any moment. And that instability makes you more desperate to protect your position, which makes the belief even stronger, which makes you even more fragile. Recognizing worth contingent on rank means noticing when losing position feels like losing yourself. When someone else's success triggers not just envy but shame. When your mood depends entirely on where you stand relative to others. And asking whether the worth you're chasing through rank is real, or whether you've mistaken position for value so thoroughly that you've forgotten you were worthwhile all along. Need for uniqueness. Everyone's wearing the same thing, the same style, the same brands, the same aesthetic. And you can't stand it, not because there's anything wrong with what they're wearing, but because being the same as everyone else feels like disappearing. Like you're just another face in the crowd. So you find something different. Something that sets you apart. Not because you love it, because it's not what everyone else has. The need for uniqueness is the drive to distinguish yourself from others through choices, possessions, or behaviors that signal individuality. It's not about liking unusual things. It's about not being ordinary, about standing out, about being recognizable as distinct rather than blending into the mass. The psychology is rooted in identity. In small groups, being distinctive had advantages. It made you memorable. It gave you a role. It prevented you from being interchangeable. But that same drive in mass culture creates a paradox. Everyone's trying to be unique in the same way. The strategies for standing out become templates. And the individuality you're pursuing looks increasingly like conformity to a different set of norms. The need for uniqueness drives consumption patterns that don't make sense otherwise. You avoid popular brands once they become too mainstream. Not because the quality dropped, because too many people have them. The exclusivity was the appeal. And once it's gone, so is your interest. You're not buying things you like. You're buying things others don't have. This creates a moving target. You find something unique. Others notice. They adopt it. Now it's not unique anymore. So you move on. Find the next thing. The cycle repeats. And the search for distinction becomes exhausting because the distinction is always temporary. Popularity kills uniqueness. And you're left perpetually searching for the next marker that hasn't been copied yet. The need for uniqueness also affects how you present yourself. You cultivate opinions that differ from the mainstream. Not because you've thought them through more carefully, but because agreeing with everyone else feels like losing your identity. You adopt contrarian positions, unusual tastes, niche interests, not because they resonate with you, because they separate you from the crowd. What makes the need for uniqueness particularly revealing is that it's still about others. You're not choosing based on what you genuinely value. You're choosing based on what others aren't choosing. The decision is reactive, defined by distance from the norm rather than proximity to your actual preferences. You've outsourced your identity to the negative space around everyone else's choices. The need for uniqueness also creates a trap. The more you chase distinction, the more your choices become performances. You're not being yourself. You're being not them. And that negative definition of identity is hollow, because it changes every time the crowd shifts. You're not building something stable. You're just running from sameness. And the running never ends because sameness is always there, always close, always threatening to absorb you. Status insecurity. Why do some people constantly check where they stand? Why do they need reassurance that they're still valued, still respected, still ahead? It's not confidence. It's the opposite. It's the fear that their position isn't real, that it could vanish. That one misstep will expose them as someone who never really belonged. Status insecurity is the chronic anxiety that your social position is unstable or undeserved. It's not about lacking status. You might be successful, respected, well-positioned. But none of it feels solid. It feels precarious, like you're one mistake away from losing everything. And that fear shapes every decision. The psychology often stems from rapid ascent. You rose quickly, got opportunities you didn't expect, achieved things ahead of schedule. And instead of feeling proud, you feel like an imposter. Like the success wasn't earned. Like people will eventually realize you don't deserve to be where you are. So you overcompensate. You work harder, signal more, defend more aggressively, trying to prove to others and yourself that you belong. Status insecurity creates hypervigilance. You're constantly scanning for threats. Did someone question your competence? Did your contribution get overlooked? Did a peer get recognized when you didn't? Each of these registers as danger, not just setbacks. Evidence that your position is eroding, that you never really had a secure foothold to begin with. This insecurity also drives defensive behavior. Someone offers feedback. Instead of considering it, you interpret it as an attack. Because if they're right, it confirms what you already fear, that you're not as competent as your position suggests. So you defend. Not the idea. The fragile sense that you deserve to be where you are. What makes status insecurity particularly exhausting is that it's never resolved by achievement. You reach a new level. For a moment, the anxiety quiets. Then it returns, because now you're comparing yourself to people at that level. And relative to them, you feel behind again. The insecurity doesn't decrease with success. It just relocates to the next rung. Status insecurity also affects relationships. You can't be vulnerable with people who see you as successful, because vulnerability might shatter the illusion. You can't celebrate others' wins without feeling threatened, because their success highlights the gap between where they are and where you fear you really belong. So you isolate. You perform. You maintain the image. And the isolation makes the insecurity worse. The cruel part of status insecurity is that it's often invisible to others. They see someone successful, accomplished, secure. They don't see the constant internal assessment, the fear of being exposed, the exhaustion of maintaining a position that never feels truly yours. And because you can't show the insecurity without confirming it, you're trapped performing confidence you don't feel. Class signaling. Two people earn the same income, live in similar neighborhoods, have comparable jobs, but one grew up wealthy, the other didn't. And you can tell, not from what they own, from how they carry themselves, what they assume, what they don't need to prove. The difference isn't current resources. It's class, and class signals in ways money can't buy. Class signaling is the transmission of information about your social origin, education, and cultural capital through behavior, tastes, and speech. It's not about flaunting wealth. It's about displaying familiarity with the codes that mark you as belonging to a particular class. And those codes are learned early, internalized deeply, and almost impossible to fake convincingly. The signals are subtle: accent, vocabulary, references. Knowing which fork to use isn't about function. It's about demonstrating you grew up in an environment where such things mattered. The ease with which you navigate formal settings. The cultural touchstones you reference. The assumptions you make about what's normal. All of it broadcasts class origin more reliably than income ever could. Class signals create invisible hierarchies. People decode them automatically. The way you speak signals your education. Your tastes signal your cultural capital. Your comfort in certain spaces signals your background. And those signals determine how you're treated. Who takes you seriously? Who sees you as an equal? Who assumes you belong? What makes class signaling particularly powerful is that it's durable. You can change your income. You can buy expensive things. But you can't easily change the internalized codes of your origin class. The person who grew up working class and later became wealthy still carries markers of their origin. And those markers, to people trained to read them, reveal more than their current bank account. Class signaling also creates barriers that look like preferences. The wealthy don't just prefer certain restaurants, schools, or neighborhoods. They prefer spaces where class signals align, where everyone shares the same codes, where belonging is frictionless because nobody has to translate. And that preference, however unconscious, excludes people who don't signal the right class, regardless of their current resources. The signals also determine access. Jobs, schools, social circles, they all filter by class signals. Not explicitly, not through stated requirements, but through cultural fit, through who feels comfortable, through who speaks the language. And the language isn't about words. It's about the 1,000 small signals that say, I'm one of you, or I'm not. What makes class signaling particularly insidious is that it operates invisibly. People who grew up with class privilege don't see themselves as signaling. They're just being themselves, acting naturally, expressing their authentic tastes. They don't realize that what feels natural to them is actually learned behavior. Cultural capital accumulated through years of immersion in environments most people never access. And that capital, invisible to them, functions as a barrier to everyone who didn't grow up with it. Pecking order psychology. Chickens, when grouped together, establish a hierarchy. The strongest bird pecks the one below it. That bird pecks the next one down, and so on. A clear, linear ranking. Each bird knows exactly where it stands, who it can dominate, who dominates it. It's brutal. It's efficient. And it's not limited to chickens. Pecking order psychology is the human tendency to organize into clear, linear hierarchies where each individual's position relative to everyone else is understood and enforced. It's not subtle. It's not ambiguous. Someone's on top. Someone's on the bottom. And everyone in between knows exactly where they stand. The mechanism is rooted in conflict avoidance. Constantly fighting over resources or status is costly. So groups develop shortcuts. Establish rank once, then maintain it through ritualized displays of dominance and submission. The person higher in rank asserts. The person lower defers. And the interaction confirms the hierarchy without requiring actual combat. It's efficient. But it's also rigid. Pecking orders show up everywhere. Workplaces, social groups, families, friend circles. Anywhere people interact repeatedly, hierarchies emerge. And once they're established, they're hard to change. because changing them requires challenging someone above you. And challenging means risking retaliation, exclusion, or loss of the position you do have. Safer to accept the order, even when it's unjust. The psychology of pecking orders creates predictable behavior. People assert dominance over those below them and show deference to those above. The assertion isn't always aggressive. Sometimes it's subtle, taking credit, speaking over someone, dismissing contributions, claiming space. The message is always the same. I'm above you, and the person below accepts it, because fighting back is costly. What makes pecking order psychology particularly oppressive is that it's internalized. You don't just know your rank. You believe it's correct. The person above you deserves to be there. They're more competent, more valuable, more worthy. You deserve to be where you are. And the person below you deserves to be below. The hierarchy isn't imposed. It's accepted. And that acceptance makes it almost impossible to dismantle. Pecking orders also create perverse incentives. People don't strive to improve the system. They strive to move up within it, to get above someone else, to have someone below them. The goal isn't equality. It's superiority. And that goal requires someone to be inferior. So even people who suffer under the hierarchy defend it. Because the possibility of rising is more appealing than the possibility of flattening the structure entirely. The cruelty of pecking orders is that they punish the bottom disproportionately. The person at the top gets deference from everyone. The person at the bottom gets dominated by everyone. And unlike chickens, humans remember, the psychological cost of being at the bottom isn't just submission. It's internalized worthlessness, the belief that you deserve to be there, that you're less than. And that belief, once internalized, becomes self-fulfilling. You act like someone who belongs at the bottom. And the behavior confirms the rank. Recognition dependence. You did good work. You know it. The project succeeded. The results were clear. But no one acknowledged it. No one said anything. And instead of feeling satisfied, you feel invisible. Like the work didn't count because it wasn't seen. Like value only exists when someone else confirms it. Recognition dependence is the psychological state where your sense of accomplishment, worth, or satisfaction depends on external acknowledgement. It's not enough to do well. Someone has to notice. Someone has to validate. Someone has to tell you it mattered. Without that confirmation, the achievement feels empty. And you feel empty too. The psychology is rooted in social learning. From childhood, you were rewarded for achievements, grades, praise, recognition. And over time, the external validation became the signal that you'd done something worthwhile. The internal sense of accomplishment atrophied. Because why trust your own judgment when others' judgment is clearer, more objective, more real? Recognition dependence creates a trap. You do things not because they matter to you, but because they'll be recognized. You choose visible projects over meaningful ones. You prioritize work that others will see over work that actually needs doing. The metric isn't impact. It's acknowledgement. And that metric shapes everything. This shows up in how you react to being overlooked. Someone else gets credit for work you contributed to. Instead of being annoyed, you're devastated. Because the lack of recognition doesn't just mean you were overlooked. It means the work didn't count. You didn't count. The value you created evaporated the moment it wasn't seen. Recognition dependence also creates vulnerability. You're at the mercy of others' attention. And attention is fickle. People forget. They misattribute. They focus on the wrong things. And when they do, you're left with work you're proud of but can't feel proud of. Because pride for you requires permission. And the permission didn't come. What makes recognition dependence particularly painful is that it never ends. You get recognized. It feels good. For a moment. Then the feeling fades. And now you need more. the next acknowledgement, the next validation, the next confirmation that what you're doing matters. The dependence doesn't decrease with recognition. It intensifies, because the recognition isn't filling a need. It's temporarily satisfying a craving that comes back stronger each time. Recognition dependence also distorts priorities. You stop asking whether the work is good. You start asking whether it will be noticed. You stop evaluating based on your own standards. You start evaluating based on what you think others will value. And slowly, you lose touch with what you actually care about, because caring about something that won't be recognized feels pointless. And the only things that feel worthwhile are the things others will see. The trap is that recognition dependence makes you dependent on something you can't control. Other people's attention. Other people's judgment. Other people's willingness to acknowledge your contributions. And when your sense of worth depends on something that's unstable, you're never secure. You're always performing, always waiting, always hoping someone will notice. And the hope, more than the work itself, becomes what you're actually doing. Invidious comparison. You're doing fine. Actually, you're doing well, better than most people, but you don't feel it. Because you're not comparing yourself to most people. You're comparing yourself to the person who has slightly more, earned slightly more, achieved slightly faster. And that comparison doesn't motivate you. It poisons you. With resentment, with inadequacy. With the sense that what you have doesn't count because someone else has more. Invidious comparison is the practice of measuring yourself against people positioned just above you in ways that generate envy and dissatisfaction rather than inspiration. It's not productive comparison. It's corrosive. The gap feels small enough to be personal, close enough to feel like failure, and that proximity makes it hurt. The term, invidious, means likely to cause resentment, and that's exactly what these comparisons do. You don't resent people far above you. Their success is too distant to feel like a judgment on your position. But the person just ahead? That stings. Because if they can have it and you can't, the gap isn't about circumstances. It's about you. About what you're lacking. About why you're not enough. Invidious comparisons are constant. A peer gets promoted before you. A friend buys a house when you're still renting. A colleague gets recognition for work similar to what you do. None of these people are your enemies, but each success feels like a theft. Like they took something that should have been yours. Or worse, like they proved they deserved something you're still chasing. The psychology creates bitterness. You start resenting people you used to like, not because they wronged you, because their position relative to yours triggers shame. And shame, when it has nowhere else to go, turns into resentment. You find reasons their success doesn't count. They got lucky. They had advantages. They compromised in ways you wouldn't. The explanations protect you from the conclusion that they're just better. Invidious comparison also traps you in narrow focus. You're not seeing the full picture of your life. You're fixated on the one dimension where someone else is ahead, and that fixation makes everything else invisible. You have health, relationships, stability, skills, but none of it registers. Because the only thing that matters is the gap, and as long as the gap exists, nothing else counts. What makes invidious comparison particularly destructive is that it's self-selected. You choose who to compare yourself to, and you don't choose people far below or far above. You choose people just ahead, close enough that the comparison feels relevant. And that choice guarantees dissatisfaction, because there's always someone just ahead. Always a gap. Always a reminder that you're not quite there yet. Invidious comparison also prevents genuine connection. The people you're comparing yourself to could be friends, allies, sources of support, but the comparison turns them into competitors, threats, evidence of your inadequacy. And you can't be close to someone who makes you feel small. So you pull back, avoid them, or worse, undermine them. Not because you want them to fail, because their failure would close the gap, and closing the gap would end the pain. The cruelest part of invidious comparison is that it's never just one person. You compare up to the next level. You catch up, and immediately you find someone else just ahead. The comparison shifts, the resentment transfers, and the cycle repeats. Because the problem isn't the gap. It's the framework, the belief that your worth is determined by where you stand relative to whoever happens to be just above you. And that framework guarantees that satisfaction is always just out of reach.